Hey y'all! Just to be clear off the top, this is me combining all 4 parts of my Nevermore Notes series Everything Interview with the Vampire together into one big mega video for the channel, and it's sort of like experimental to see if you guys would want the whole thing clipped together. But after each part, Present Day Jess will intervene and add a couple additional thoughts or feelings. So if you've already seen parts 1 through 4 and you don't want to rewatch, you can just jump to the relevant timestamp. But before I let the original part 1 play, I do want to make some corrections off jump. During this review, I pronounced the main vampire character's name Louis, both Louis and Louis in an alternating way. And for my money, I do think either pronunciation is correct, with Louis being more French and also more like New Orleansian, so perhaps being more correct. But the spelling of the name is also pronounced Louis, so I don't necessarily think that's a wrong way to say it, although I've been corrected multiple times. At this juncture, I have settled on using the Louis pronunciation going forward, but you are going to see me hop between the two within this video. I call the person who is interviewing Louis David, and that is incorrect. It's Daniel. Full apology there. I do have like some reading processing issues, including dyslexia, and it's not an excuse. I should have, I don't know, done more research or triple, quadruple checked, but for whatever reasons, my brain processed that name one way and then just continued to process it that way for the rest of the novel. Additionally, in the keynote presentation, there are some grammar, editing, slide transition issues. I checked a slide deck I made so many times to make sure the transitions, the spelling, the formatting was correct, and there still are typos, which I think just goes to show that no matter who you are or how often you check something, you need an outside third party as an editor to sort of like help you fill in those gaps and those things that your brain has already like decided look one way when they look an entirely different way. And then just in general, this is something that I filmed and put out in 2023, and I feel like I've learned so much, as well as like there have been some updates to Final Cut Pro that have really made some of the things I'm doing in this video much easier. So you're going to see some imperfections, some glitches, some stuff that kind of made me cringe when I was rewatching this footage to create this compilation. And it just is what it is. But I'll kick it back to past Jess and she'll go ahead and give you the rundown on the Nevermore Notes thing. Welcome to Everything Interview with a Vampire Part 1. This is going to be a 4-part series. We're going to cover each one of the parts of Interview with a Vampire separately, and this is because covering both what happened, all of the relevant quotes, and diving into the different thematic elements that Interview with a Vampire and further installments of the Vampire Chronicles are rife with has taken me a long time to do, and I think it's going to end up being a very long-winded video. I am tentatively planning to stitch all 4 parts together into one long video when this series is complete. But for now, let's just get into it. Do an author's intentions matter? Anne Rice wrote Interview with a Vampire during one of the worst times in her life, right after she was getting over her young daughter's death of cancer. While Anne Rice claims it was entirely unintended, Interview with a Vampire is steeped in ennui and questions of life, death, and human mortality. It's worth mentioning right here at the top that I don't dive into all of the elements of loss and death that this book covers, even though it's probably the main thematic draw of Interview, because there are so many little details and bits you could pick apart about different relationships throughout the book. I'd literally be rereading and quoting the entire thing to you. Later books in the Chronicle of the Vampire series do move past the state of loss and grief, both thematically and tonally. The Vampire Chronicles in general have a huge following of readers and fans, and we all bring something a little bit different and special to this literary work. You can see this in a lot of discussions about the themes and intricacies that you find both in Interview with a Vampire and further Vampire Chronicle novels. The historical span of time covered in the Vampire Chronicles as a whole is so large that it gives us a little bit of insight into racial, gender, age, and ability interpretations throughout history. And it also gives us a chance to sort of like meta talk a little bit about whether or not this is an 80s take or a historical historical take, or some kind of in-between. And each reader is going to bring their own personal insight and experience. Some things we can ask on our journey: are these undercurrents intentional? Does intentionality matter in regard to how audiences choose to read this text or other installments? When are we getting a more modern perspective versus a more historical perspective? And what do we think of that perspective now as readers versus maybe what readers thought of it when it was released? Anne Rice made the conscientious decision to tell Lewis's story through an interview narrative. Lewis is telling us the story as he remembers it, or how he wants it to be remembered or thought of now. So we should be on the lookout for different perceptions that might not have been there at the time, or different wording or phrasing that might be coloring something now as he's sharing it that wouldn't have been there originally. And we should also pay special note to when the interviewer, David, actually interrupts Lewis and asks him questions. Part of the reason we have to evaluate whether or not Lewis is being truthful or whether or not Lewis's memory is accurate. This one-off book did become an entire series, and the later installments are mostly told from Lestat and other vampires' perspectives, and we need to start asking ourselves what really happened. Let's roll right into part 1. Interview with a Vampire is set in New Orleans in the 1980s. And we're meeting David. He's referred to as the boy, although it's worth noting Lewis seems to call anyone under 50 a boy. He's recording this vampire story on tape for us. At first, David seems a little bit skeptical of whether or not Lewis is a vampire or not, and that lasts for all of 10 paragraphs. The vampire was utterly white and smooth, as if he were sculpted from bleached bone, and his face was seemingly as inanimate as a statue, except for 2 brilliant green eyes that looked down at the boy intently, like flames in a skull. Page 4, Interview with a Vampire. Since David met Lewis at a bar, there has always been some level of fan speculation that this was a gay bar and that David is gay or bisexual. This adds an interesting element to David and Lewis's interactions going forward. Further colors the narrative that Lewis shares with us when we think about his relationship between himself and Lestat, and later himself and Armand. Meet Lewis. He's very serious and dour. He consistently insists that he will not hurt David. And it's very unclear if we should believe him or not, because a lot of times he says it completely unprompted by David or any actions David's taking. Lewis insists that he is detached from humanity, but he seems to enjoy messing with David and getting a rise out of him. Ah, that's the accent, the boy said softly. For a moment, the vampire stared blankly. I have an accent? He began to laugh, and the boy, flustered, answered quickly. I noticed it in the bar when I asked you what you did for a living. It's just a slight sharpness of consonants, that's all. I never guessed it was French. It's all right, the vampire assured him. I'm not as shocked as I pretend to be. It's only that I forget it from time to time. But let me go on. Page 5, Interview with a Vampire. Lewis starts us off at the very beginning of his tale when he's human. He's 25 years old in 1791, living with his family in a plantation called Point de Lac. His father's deceased. Lewis is in charge of the plantation. He has his mother, his younger sister, and a younger brother in tow that he cares for. Mother and sister are quite easy to take care of. They like to go out and party and socialize. Religious brother seems to take a little bit more work. He helps protect the brother from the mother and sister's desire for him to join them in these parties. He builds the brother an oratory so he can sit and pray. While this brother is never named, he is incredibly important to Lewis, and he doesn't take the warning signs of something going potentially amiss with his brother very seriously, although the slaves and his sister and his mother all think his brother is going insane because he stops taking care of himself or his surroundings and simply sits in his oratory staring at the cross. And Lewis is convinced that this isn't madness, this is just a sign of his brother's devotion. one more certainty that eventually his brother is going to go and follow his dreams as a priest. Until one night, Lewis's brother comes to him and tells him he's had a vision from God. He is a saint. He needs to go back to France to preach the good word and convert the heathens. To do this successfully, Lewis needs to sell the plantation and give all of his money to his brother. Naturally, Lewis laughs at his brother. The two of them have a huge argument. The brother storms out. He falls on the stairs and dies. Lewis is immediately heartbroken and grief-stricken. He refuses to talk to his sister or mother about what actually happened. There's some suspicion that Lewis might have actually pushed him, although Lewis denies this vehemently to David. This is where we begin to see Lewis as a philosophical monster. Even now, hundreds of years later, he's still hung up on the death of his brother. He doesn't know whether or not his brother really had a vision or not, whether or not as a good Catholic man he should have believed in his brother and it was some kind of ego that held him back from believing him. Not only did I not believe he saw visions, I couldn't entertain the notion for a moment because he was my brother. Holy he might be. Particular, most definitely. But Francis of Assisi? No, not my brother. No brother of mine could be such. That is egotism. Do you see? Page 8 to 9 on Interview with a Vampire. This element is fairly open-ended, so some things we as readers have to ask ourselves. Did Lewis's brother really have a vision? Did Lewis's brother make this story up as a way to get the family money? Was Lewis's brother mentally ill and in need of some kind of help? Is Lewis responsible for his brother's death? Lewis and his family move out of Point de Loc and into town. Here, Lewis is getting drunk and starting bar fights and basically courting death. During one of these altercations, he gets so ill that a priest is called, and for the first time, Lewis opens up about his brother's death and confesses everything to this priest because he fears he might truly die. The priest, however, laughs and scorns Lewis as a weak man. He says he is choosing to die alongside his brother instead of living for his sister and mother. And he claims the vision that Lewis's brothers had weren't heavenly ones, but devilish ones. Lewis uses this little side point to discuss religion and religious men in a fairly derogatory manner. People who cease to believe in God or goodness altogether still believe in the devil. Evil is always possible, and goodness eternally difficult. But to stand in the presence of a saint, to believe a saint has sent a vision? No. It's egotism, our refusal to believe it could occur in our midst. Page 13, Interview with a Vampire. And this is when Lewis finally meets Lestat and begins his vampire journey. Lestat's a fairly young vampire. We know this because he's traveling with his mortal father. He seems to choose Lewis for a lot of reasons, but primarily because he's wealthy. Even at this first meeting, it does seem like there's a lot of sexual tension between the two of them. The overall description of Lestat is highly reminiscent of how a crush might describe their focus of love. And as soon as Lewis becomes a vampire, he begins hating, resenting, and finding fault with Lestat. A lot of times, some of these complaints against Lestat come off as Lewis having a superiority complex or being disparaging to Lestat's stature in life. Lewis doesn't seem to be trying to understand where Lestat is coming from any more than Lestat is trying to understand where Lewis is coming from. As far as Lewis's actual turning, he describes it a lot like a frat boy hazing ritual. First, he witnesses the murder of his plantation slave overseer. He forces Lewis to dispose of the corpse in the woods. Lewis is sort of scarred by this interaction, and he's sort of having second thoughts about the whole vampire thing. He tells Lestat to call the whole thing off, but it's way too late for that, and Lestat basically laughs at him, grabs him, and drains him to the point of near death, where he then cuts his own wrist, brings it to Lewis's mouth, and has Lewis drink his blood. The vampire's sense is taken, he's overwhelmed, born new, and in love with the world again. That evening, there's some gross disposal of human fluids that go on for Lewis, and Lestat says he's not quite a vampire yet, but the next evening he'll be born again, a vampire in truth. And we're left asking ourselves, what's the difference between the human and the vampire Lewis? Lewis insists to David that the vampire transformation is as much mental as it was physical. He acts as if this death removed all forms of humanity from him, and he uses his obsession with the loss of his brother as proof. I passed my brother's oratory without so much as a thought of him. But this proof, to me, overlooks a couple essential things. Lewis seems truly tormented and tortured over the loss of his brother all these years later. It never really adequately addresses Lewis's choice to reside in the oratory after he's transformed. Becoming a vampire at best seems to be a distraction, especially because we know humans do get over loss and handle grief in different ways. If you're in a survival situation, you might handle the loss of a loved one as just something you shrug off and continue to move with because you have to survive. Lewis has his first kill coming up, and this is the beginning of his endless list of gripes. Lewis describes drinking blood as overwhelming all of his senses. And if he were Lestat training the new vampire, he'd have started that vampire off with animals and worked them up to humans. Lestat starts Lewis off feeding on humans and generally laughs at him for his reaction. He sort of derogatorily mentions in an offhand kind of way, you have to stop drinking before the person dies, or else that person's blood will drag you to true death. And he feeds on animals exclusively for the next 4 years. Meanwhile, Lestat loves being a vampire. He kills multiple people a night. He'll kill slaves, he'll kill nobles, he's 100% indiscriminate. Although Lewis does notice a pattern in how Lestat kills, and he claims that Lestat not noticing this own pattern is just one more way he's entirely unself-aware. A fresh young girl, that was his favorite for the first of the evening. But the triumphant kill for Lestat was a younger man. A young man around your age would have appealed to him in particular. They represented the greatest loss to Lestat because they stood on the threshold of maximum possibility of life. Of course, Lestat didn't understand himself. I came to understand it. Lestat understood nothing. On page 41 of Interview with a Vampire. And some other things we can look at this early juncture is, what does killing mean to Lewis? Why is killing animals so much simpler than humans? Why does Lewis assume that killing means something different for Lestat than it does him? And can we, the readers, learn anything about Lewis or Lestat based off of their killings? For the next 4 years, Lewis and Lestat live at Point de Lac with Lestat's elderly father. Lestat's generally gauche and bloodthirsty and extra, while Lewis seems to be sort of grumpy and trying to cope. Lestat ends up fixating on this one young man who's a plantation owner nearby, Frenier. Really wants to kill this guy for some reason. Meanwhile, Lewis is doing everything in his power to protect Frenier, not for himself, but because he is taking care of a bunch of young women and sisters. Of course, Lestat finally gets his way and manages to kill Frenier when he's returning from a duel. Lewis, in a desperate bid to keep the family afloat, approaches the eldest sister Babette and starts advising her on a few matters to help her get her footing and maintain the plantation. And Babette is actually pretty important for our story too. This is Lewis's second big link to humanity. He suggests that she is a perfect human. She's smart and capable in a way that's not just beyond other women, but beyond most men as well. Babette's good opinion is really important to Lewis. Lewis sort of hides in the shadows and kind of whispers to her from the outside. He really wants her to respect him, to take his advice seriously, and to succeed and flourish in this world without her brother. Looking at Lestat's father for a moment, little to no consequence in this book, but it is my goal to do these kind of breakdowns with the entire Chronicles of the Vampire series, and anything that we can get about Lestat's dad now is kind of important for us to remember going forward. Some interesting contradictions in Lestat and his relationship with his father. It seems like he hates his dad and wants him to suffer, but at the same time he loved his father enough to bring him all the way from France here to the Americas. We know there is some kind of altercation between Lestat and his dad when Lestat was a child. As his dad is dying, he's trying very hard to apologize and make some kind of amends for it, and Lestat is not having it. He's so angry at his dad, violent, he can barely stay in the room. And he begs Lewis to kill his father for him. But at the same time, it is notable that Lestat is unable to kill his father himself or to physically harm his dad in any way, even though he has this violent urge and tendency. And from this interaction, Lewis does contemplate Lestat as a man versus a vampire. Lestat, the brilliant pupil, a lover of books that had been burned. I knew only Lestat who sneered at my library, called it a pile of dust, ridiculed me relentlessly, my reading, my meditations. Page 62, Interview with a Vampire. And this makes me wonder, does Louis know Lestat at all? Lestat's mortal father humanizes him to Louis. For the first time, he wonders who Lestat was, and if Lestat is entirely different in his vampiric form, and if human Lestat and vampire Lestat are so different, is Louis also much changed? And this brings us to the Slave Rebellion. So Louis and Lestat have been living with Lestat's dad at Point de Lac, and this whole time Louis has been trying to kind of hide himself and Lestat from the slaves because there's been like kind of whisperings and rumblings. There's something not quite right. Like a lot of them are going missing and dying, and all of this eventually culminates into a massive slave uprising where they storm Point de Lac and set it on fire in an attempt to kill Louis and Lestat. So talking a little bit about the characterization of the slaves from Louis's perspective. Louis the man is able to give more credence and credit and agency to his slaves than he was as a human. That they have intelligence and a depth of experience as much as, and in some ways, greater to his white compatriots. And I think high school Jess would have seen this and been like, oh, becoming a vampire means that you no longer have racism. That might have even been like the intention of this scene originally, but I've come to view it like differently. There's still an us versus them mentality. Us the vampires versus them the humans now. He can give people of different races credit and agency and intelligence that they didn't have before. Even here, where he is like now free of prejudice, he still seems to value white lives more than he does the black slaves' lives. For example, he refers to his slaves as a mass of people, and when he talks about other white people, he usually discusses individuals specifically. Lestat equally terrorizes both the slaves and the noble people. Louis tries to stop him from killing Fournier and terrorizing the nobles. He chides Lestat for killing the slaves, but he never really tries to stop him. Louis calls out the fact that the slaves are closer to him and Lestat, that they have opportunity to see more, that they're significantly more suspicious of the two of them than any white people he meets. He never suspects until it's too late that the slaves are actually more dangerous to him than the white people are. And all of this sort of indicates that Louis is still dealing with a certain level of prejudice and presumption of one color of people against another color of people. And in some ways it's more insidious now because he's claiming that he can see and value these people equally, and he's not. And all of this is like a much longer and more interesting discussion I'm trying to set up for when I discuss Interview with a Vampire, the TV show, because this little bit we get right here touches on how race was covered within the canon of the series, and I'd like to see what the adaptation does with it when they make Louis a black man. So as the slaves are rebelling, Lestat and Louis have to flee Point de Lac, and they have nowhere to go. In desperation, Louis leads the two of them to Babette's home, and he begs her for safety from the oncoming dawn. Babette reluctantly takes them in, mostly based off of the good counsel Louis has given her in the past. While they're stuck underground waiting the day out, Babette is learning about Point de Lac's destruction and learning a little bit more about Louis and Lestat's misdeeds throughout the last few years. When she comes to let Louis and Lestat out the following night, she confronts them. She calls Louis evil and attempts to murder both of them. Her life was rich and good. I knew she mustn't do this. Like all strong people, she suffered always a measure of loneliness. She was a marginal outsider, a secret infidel of certain sort, and the balance by which she lived might be upset if she were to question her own goodness. I'd fallen back, helpless against the pillar, helpless as much from the fire and the blow as the knowledge that Babette meant to destroy me. As much from the knowledge that I did not know what I was. Louis on page 69. This confrontation with Babette shakes Louis up a lot. Her calling him evil and of the devil makes Louis wonder if he is evil and where he and vampires as a whole came from. This is a whole philosophical conversation that apparently Louis never thought of before now. And this obsession with Babette naturally leads David to interject and ask whether or not Louis loves her. Louis denies, but it is an interesting point to consider because perhaps some of the animosity between Lestat and Babette can best be explained by Louis's attention and care and interest in this rando woman, while Lestat is out here making Louis immortal, taking care of him and seeing that he lives forever. Babette, the one he's showering all this attention and care on, is attempting to destroy him. In this moment when Babette is trying to kill Louis and Lestat is striking back, Louis is stepping in between the two of them to protect Babette. He does not give a crap about Lestat. Since Louis has become a vampire, he's pretty much wanted to leave Lestat's company and hasn't been able to do it. Louis is at a new low and he thinks he has got to leave Lestat now or he will be destroyed. So Louis is now safely in New Orleans. Lestat has fed. Louis has left him and is just kind of like wandering the streets, wondering if he is a bad dude. And while he's doing all of this, his hunger is growing and growing. But instead of focusing on feeding as he knows he needs to, he's just sort of like questioning himself. And it's in this mindset where Louis meets Claudia, a 5-year-old child who is crying and desperate by her mother's plague corpse. It seems Claudia doesn't understand that her mother is dead. She goes to Louis and begs him for help. Louis is hypnotized. Her youth, her innocence. Am I damned? If so, why do I feel such pity for her gaunt face? Why do I wish to touch her tiny, soft arms, hold her now on my knee as I am doing, feel her bend her head to my chest as I gently touch her satin hair? If I am damned, I must want to kill her. I must want to make her nothing but food for a cursed existence, because being damned, I must hate her. Interview with a Vampire, page 73. In that moment, Louis decides he is damned, he does hate Claudia, and he needs to destroy her by feeding on her now. But he's also having this telltale heart moment of immense guilt, feeling her heart beating, fighting for life, and it triggers his guilt, and he unlatches from her and kind of hurls her away. In a state of denial and extreme upset, Louis turns to flee this whole scene and pretend it didn't happen, and when he looks, there's Lestat. Louis describes Lestat's reaction to him feeding off Claudia as very taunting and mean. From my perspective, I kind of read it more like Lestat celebrating Louis finally coming into the fold and becoming a vampire and embracing his nature and truth. Lestat has complained repeatedly that Louis is not like him. Feeding off of Claudia like this actually proves that Lestat and Louis are as much alike as Lestat wants them to be. And when Lestat sees Louis's reactions in earnest, he sort of like changes his tone and mood a little bit and starts to come in almost like sort of comforting or calming. Are you afraid? The child's alive, Louis. You left her breathing. Shall I go back and make her a vampire? We could use her, Louis. Wait, Louis! I'll go back for her if you say. Page 74, Interview with a Vampire. Louis fights Lestat as he never has and basically runs away from this entire scene, just trying to forget it. And as always, Louis loses steam, a sense of convictions, and just stops and lets Lestat win. But Lestat is sort of unusual tonight, and he says that the two will sleep on it and have a real conversation tomorrow. The next evening, Louis gets up and confronts Lestat. He asks why Lestat became a vampire, why Lestat is so cruel to him, and last but perhaps most importantly, why did Lestat turn him? Lestat is both silent and snide during this little tirade of Louis's. And because of this, Louis threatens to leave and find answers elsewhere. And that's when Lestat decides to drop an unexpected insight into Louis. You chase after phantoms of your former self. Fernier, his sister. These images for you of what you were and what you still long to be. And your romance with a mortal life. You're dead to your vampire nature. You are like an adult who, looking back on his childhood, realizes he never appreciated it. You no longer look through the glass darkly, but you cannot pass back to the world of a human warmth with your new eyes. Page 81, Interview with a Vampire. From this, we see that Lestat is actually pretty insightful because he does point out some interesting things about Louis's motivations on who he protects and who he doesn't, why he might have cared about Frenier and Babette, and perhaps even why he cares about Claudia now. As we gave Louis credit for his insights into Lestat based off of his skills, we may have to give the same benefit to Lestat as he points out these elements within Louis. Of all the things I took away from it, this scene to me pointed out most that neither vampire knew the other very well. They could get small glimpses based off of their kills and actions, but they weren't seeing the whole of it. Louis and Lestat have very different priorities. Louis wishes to reduce the suffering of sentient beings, and Lestat is more concerned with his own pleasure. Louis confronts Lestat about his wasteful and murderous ways. If I can live from the blood of animals, why should I not live from the blood of animals rather than go through the world bringing misery and death among human creatures? And Lestat responds, "Does this give you happiness? This is insanity, Louis. For I guarantee that if you walk the streets tonight and strike down a woman as rich and beautiful as Babette and suck her blood until she drops to your feet, you will be filled with all of her life you can hold. With the same sensibility that you cherish, you will see death in all its beauty. Life as it is, only known all the more on the point of death." Page 82. So more on this vampire nature. It seems both Louis and Lestat yearn for the beauty of life. Louis views Lestat's actions as the destruction of that. Lestat sees his own kills as taking the beauty into himself and keeping it forever. Lestat posits that death is a vampire's nature, part of the divine plan. The juxtaposition between Louis's longing for that life and Lestat's taking of that life seems to imply true vampire nature is as a vessel that strains between being empty and full. There's only the longing for what they don't have and the taking until they're sated and full for a moment. And one more lore drop. Lestat warns Louis away from seeking other vampires. They'll see you coming long before you see them, and they'll see your flaw. And, distrusting you, they'll seek to kill you. They'd seek to kill you even if you were like me, because they are lone predators and seek for companionship no more than cats in the jungle. They're jealous of their secrets and of their territory, and if you find one or more of them together, it will be for safety only, and one will be the slave of the other, the way you are with me. There's no way to know if Lestat's words are meant as an intimidation or if they're the truth, but we should ask, are other vampires as Lestat claims? Would they shun Louis for his nature? Would they shun Lestat for his? Do they seek others of their kind, or do they see them as a threat? Is the loneliness present in Louis and Lestat unique to them and not found in others of their kind? This conversation brings Louis into a trance very similar to the one he fell under when he first met Lestat. Lestat urges him to come with him where they go, find Claudia still alive in an orphanage, and adopt her. Lestat urges Louis to drink from her again. When he's brought her to the point of near death, Lestat stops Louis, offers his wrist to Claudia, and she feeds greedily from him. So strongly, Lestat struggles to get away from her teeth. David interrupts here to say he'd done this to the little girl just to keep you with him. Louis speculates there are multiple reasons for Claudia's turning. Lestat does want to keep Louis and the money with him. Lestat sees Claudia as an experiment to see what the vampire nature truly is. And third, Lestat kills Claudia out of revenge. He had been truly vulnerable with Louis in that conversation. The only way for him to get back on top is a show of strength. Turning Claudia works. For the next 65-ish years, there is domestic bliss in this vampire household. Louis loves and cherishes Claudia, and Lestat seems to enjoy her company as well. But even as Louis is comforted by Claudia, her presence also makes him aware of how vulnerable he and she are to Lestat, and it makes him hesitate from rebelling. Louis is there to provide love, companionship, reading, philosophy, art, and Lestat is there teaching Claudia everything there is about being a vampire and killing viciously and cunningly. Claudia seems to enjoy both of their presences and lessons equally. The only thing in those early years that concern Louis at all is that for several of them, Claudia remains mute. Claudia and Lestat might hunt and seduce, stay long in the company of the doomed victim, enjoying the splendid humor of his unwitting friendship with death. But I still could not bear it. Page 97, Interview with a Vampire. And Lewis himself is an evolved predator. He starts killing humans. In New Orleans, he finds the people there a faceless mass, a sea parting before him. He has no personal connection to anyone, and he no longer loves humanity as he once loved Babette. What has changed Lewis's feeding habits? Is it the companionship with Claudia? Is it to protect Claudia from Lestat because he knows Lestat would like this? Is it just simply that Lewis is like so many other people and is able to do terrible things to an anonymous person, but not to someone he's personally connected to? Claudia's mind continues to evolve and mature as her body never will. She stops playing with the younger childish toys and picks up more adult sophisticated things. Her outfits become more elaborate, and she has plans and insights that would never come to a child's mind. And as these changes happen, Claudia starts to become more reserved. Eventually, she even demands her own child's coffin so that she can sleep separately from Lewis, which devastates him. And when Claudia sees how incredibly upset Lewis is by this, she says to him, "I don't want it if it hurts you. I'll stay with you always, but I must see it. Don't you understand? A coffin for a child." Claudia's trying to come to terms with the fact that she is in a child's body while her two mentors and companions are in an adult's body. She needs to know what that means and come to some kind of understanding. Instead of this coffin helping her, though, Claudia's erratic behavior continues to escalate. One night she kills all the household servants and just leaves them in the townhouse. When Lestat and Lewis find them, Lestat flies into a rage and demands Lewis clean it up. Claudia returns home, Lestat starts laying into her about killing at the house and leaving it there, and Claudia just interrupts him and demands to know how she was made, which shocks Lestat into silence and just seems to further drive Claudia into prodding at him and poking him. While we could read Lestat's refusal to explain how Claudia came into being as just another extension of him withholding vampire secrets from Lewis and now Claudia as well, we might also see it as a kindness to Lewis, because we know that Lewis played a part in Claudia's turning, also know that Lewis has some kind of guilt towards that, and that he needs Claudia's love and relationship to survive and be happy. So in some ways, Lestat is protecting both himself as well as Lewis. Eventually, Claudia begs Lewis to tell what he knows, and Lewis succumbs and tells her everything. At first, Claudia does rage at Lewis and the part he played in her death. She seems to get over the betrayal, and she says, "I have no human nature, yet I have your tongue, your passion for the truth. Your need to drive the needle of the mind right to the heart of it all. Like the beak of the hummingbird who beats so wild and fast that mortals might think he has no tiny feet, could never set. Just go from quest to quest, going again and again for the heart of it. I am your vampire self more than you are. And now, the sleep of 65 years has ended." He made me then, to be your companion. No chains could have held you in your loneliness, and he could give you nothing. He gives me nothing. I used to think him charming. I liked the way he walked, the way he tapped the flagstones with his walking stick and swung me in his arms, and the abandon with which he killed, which was as I felt. But I no longer find him charming, and you never have. Page 116 to 117, Interview with a Vampire. And let's take a minute and ask here, why does Claudia need to know how she was made? Claudia's never really had an opportunity to see herself as human in the way both Lewis and Lestat have. So we do have to wonder what this child to adult equation is in her. Why she thinks her body doesn't match her attitude and who she is. Claudia devises a plan for Lewis and her to leave Lestat. Lewis doesn't believe that Lestat will let the two of them go, and Claudia tells him she plans to kill Lestat. Lewis protests. Claudia argues a bit with him, refuses to go into details, and insists that Lewis just let her handle it. And meanwhile, Lewis makes arrangements for the two of them to leave New Orleans. Notably, within Lewis's plans, he does include funds to leave Lestat. Here we get a David interruption where he asks if Claudia was destroyed in her attempt to kill Lestat. And Lewis doesn't really answer this question. He just says, "Don't you think she could do it?" Put a pin in that. Back to Lestat. He's made friends with this musician. Louis doesn't think anything about it at first because Lestat likes to play with his victims and often befriends them, but he's been hanging out with this musician and funding him for a long time. And Louis is kind of beginning to wonder if he's fond of him or not. One night, Lestat comes back from visiting his musician buddy and is in like a grand mood. Asks Louis if he remembers the Frenier household and realizes that there are now rumors it's been haunted. And this is our opportunity to catch up with Babette. Babette had died young, insane, restrained finally from wandering towards the ruins of Pointe-du-Lac, insisting she had seen the devil and she must find him. I thought occasionally of going to her, of trying some way to rectify what I had done. The other times, I thought it would all heal itself. And this little mini update does have us wondering, why does Louis care about Babette if he's truly divorced from humanity, as he says he is? And what does Babette's death mean to Louis? And what does the Frenier place and its haunting mean to Lestat? Here he is in a jovial mood, enjoying his new friendship and his new time with the musician, and now he's needling Louis for some reason. So Claudia interrupts this squabble before it can truly take off, and she and Lestat argue for a little bit, but Claudia insists she's here to apologize and make amends. While Lestat is skeptical, Claudia has some great wisdom to drop on us. Hell is hatred, people living together in eternal hatred. We're not in hell. You can take the present or not, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Only, let's have an end to all this. So Claudia offers Lestat 2 young boys she found in the orphanage for him to feed on. They're sleeping peacefully in a bed surrounded by wine and food that they had their fill of beforehand. Lestat is enthralled by the 2 children, seems to immediately accept the apology, even offers Claudia one of the children to feed on. Mutual, all is forgiven. But something was wrong. Lestat was staring at the ceiling. He lay too still. He appeared to shiver, his shoulders convulsing. A veil had fallen over his clear gray eyes. Page 134, Interview with a Vampire. Turns out Claudia poisoned the blood of both boys and plans to kill Lestat this way. She warns Louis to stay back, pulls out her knife, and starts stabbing Lestat over and over again. And every time Louis tries to intervene, she tells him to stay back, she's got this. And eventually, with all the blood pooling everywhere, Lestat just stops struggling. His form withers, and Claudia, coated in this Gorn viscera, stares and tells Louis to look too. Horrified and in a state of immense emotional distress, the thing lay still. A great mass of wavy blonde hair, a coat, a pair of gleaming boots, and thus horror that had been Lestat, and I staring helplessly at it. Moving into the aftermath of this attack. For a long time, Claudia merely stood there. Blood had soaked the carpet, darkening the woven wreaths of flowers. It gleamed sticky and black on the floorboards. It stained her dress, her white shoes, her cheek. She wiped it with a crumpled napkin and took a swipe at the impossible stains of the dress. Claudia has to prod Louis and get him to help her lift all the boys and Lestat into the carriage to dispose of the bodies. They drive out to a swamp. Louis gets rid of the young boys first. He carries a white sheet wrapped Lestat out further and deeper than he went with either of the boys, and he stands there staring at the corpse of Lestat in the water for a long time. This is Lestat. This is all of transformation and mystery, dead, gone into the eternal darkness. I felt a pull suddenly, as some forever were struggling for me to go down with him, to descend into the dark water and never come back. It spoke without language, saying, "You know what you must do. Come down into the darkness. Let it all go away." He hated living with Lestat. He thought the guy was a douche canoe. He took every opportunity in this monologue so far to belittle Lestat, and Louis did not think that Lestat would ever let him or Claudia leave, so he felt the 3 of them just had to chill out and be miserable together forever. Now that Lestat is dead, Louis is gutted at his loss, incredibly betrayed that Claudia did what she said she was going to do and what was the only way for the two of them to get away from him. What explains Louis's feelings and reactions here? The next evening, Claudia is up early and she's throwing Lestat's belongings around, looking for something, anything that would indicate where they could start looking for other vampires. And she's really upset and frustrated because he left nothing behind. She turns to Louis looking for comfort, and Louis is just stone cold to her. Doesn't want her to stay in his coffin anymore. He basically just wants her to get out and never to have to deal with her again. And that causes a complete transformation and breakdown in Claudia. I would die rather than live without you. I would die the same way he died. I can't bear for you to look at me the way you did. I cannot bear it if you do not love me. Her sobs grew worse, more bitter, until finally I bent and kissed her soft neck and cheeks. Winter plums. Plums from an enchanted wood where the fruit would never fall from the boughs, where the flowers would never wither and die. All right, my dear, I said to her, and I rocked her slowly, gently, in my arms, until she dozed, murmuring something about our being eternally happy, free of Lestat forever, beginning the great adventure of our lives. And this leads us to, what is Claudia feeling? Does she truly love and feel an emotional bond between the two of them? Does she need his love and approval to continue to live? Is she truly willing to lay down and die if Louis turns away from her? And what is Louis feeling in this moment? This crying seems to snap him out of it. And this angst fest is just beginning because Lestat's death has triggered Louis to think about his brother's death. And he passes by this church and goes in there to be all maudlin or whatever. He has like this intense hallucination or imagining about the church and God and holiness. Basically, he decides that like the church doesn't have God in it and the only thing that's immortal in there is him. In this moment where he's in this church, a priest approaches him, asks if he wants or needs confession. Louis agrees to do confession, and then he goes in there and impulsively tells him all about him being a vampire and a crazy murderer. The priest does not react well. Louis reacts badly to how the priest is reacting, reveals himself in the light. The priest is in terror and trying to backpedal and calling for God to save him. Louis sinks his teeth into the priest and kills him. It's a very interesting little part of the story because it means that Louis is at the same point that Lestat was at when he tried to kill Babette. A couple days later, Lestat's musician friend actually comes to their townhouse looking for Lestat, which Louis thinks is pretty unusual and odd. He tries to make the musician go away by giving him money, telling him that Lestat wanted him to be well and healthy, and the musician is not really buying it. His eyes seem glazed over. He seems very insistent that Lestat wouldn't leave without him, that there should be a personal letter of some kind if this is the case. But eventually Louis kind of just like shoves him out with the money and kind of like shoulder shrugs and is like, nothing to see here. It's kind of an interesting scene because it sort of starts establishing the cult of Lestat, that Lestat has like this magnetism about him that goes beyond being charming or charismatic or even beautiful. Sometimes Louis seems to fall under this spell, like when he was turned. There's something just about Lestat that drives people to want to be near him and devoted to him. But Claudia and Louis are off returning to normal. They're packing up the house. They're making plans to go overseas and look for vampires so Claudia can finally be with her own kind. The way she says that makes Louis realize that he is not part of her own kind. All this time that Louis thought Claudia was out there sating her needs the same way that Lestat did, it was like something else for her. She's still looking for some sort of kindred spirit. And David interrupts, asking why Louis didn't teach her Claudia humanity the same way that he taught her so many other things. To what avail? Asked the vampire simply. So she might suffer as I did? Oh, I'll grant you, I should have taught her something to prevail against her desire to kill Lestat. For my own sake, I should have taught her that. But you see, I had no confidence in anything else. Once fallen from grace, I had confidence in nothing. On the night Louis and Claudia are meant to leave New Orleans forever and begin their grand vampire journey, Claudia runs back to the townhouse in a panic, insisting something is following her. Louis looks out the window and at first he thinks it's nothing, but then he sees the musician now turned vampire, definitely following and stalking Claudia. And as Louis is trying to process this and figure out what's going on, he hears a very familiar but what he thought was impossible footstep on the townhouse step. That's right, Lestat's alive, he's turned a musician, and he is here to get revenge on Louis and Claudia. A fight ensues between the four vampires, and Louis and Claudia end up getting the upper hand by setting the townhouse and the vampires on fire. In all of the commotion while everything is burning, they rush out of the townhouse, they escape the mob, and they get onto the boat to sail away to their adventure. Louis stays awake the whole night, waiting for Lestat to come after them, and when they set up anchor and sail away, that's when he's decided they are finally free. But Louis is certain the first attack didn't kill Lestat, that he somehow got out of the second one just fine too. And that's going to be the end of our part 1 recap of Interview with a Vampire. I hope you're enjoying it so far. I did my best to pick out some good quotes, some good dramatic moments, and also to pick a couple themes here and there that might be interesting to viewers, but might also not be the normal fare that you'd get in a standard discussion. If you guys are enjoying this so far, let me know in those comments down below. If nothing else, leave me a vampire emoji to let me know you got this far in the video. Rereading all of the old Vampire Chronicles to catch me up, new Vampire Chronicle releases, was a main reason I bought these books and intended to reread. One of the reasons they ended up becoming a major project on this channel, though, is because Interview with the Vampire was a TV show that had released the previous year, and I really wanted to watch it, but first I wanted to reread Interview with the Vampire, and I figured I'd create some content to go with it, in case anyone else was sort of in the same boat as me and wanted to catch up with the book before they dove into the TV show. That said, I had minimal knowledge of what was going to happen in season 1 of the TV show before going into this project. I knew we had aged up Daniel, and I knew that Louis was now black and set in a different time period because it was sort of hard to ignore those changes to the source material. And with that information, you can see here in part 1, I tried to focus in on the few elements we have about race or gender or the age of Daniel and what he's doing and why he's doing it. As someone who's stitching this all together after I have seen season 1 and season 2 of the Interview with the Vampire TV show, I have some more thoughts. But if you did want to go in depth with an episode by episode review in comparison to the books, I actually have standalone reviews for each one of those episodes that you can check out there. These ones are just the ones that are hitting me as most relevant. And I am probably going to step into it a little bit because I find season 1 of the Interview with the Vampire show kind of confused, and I'm pretty critical of it. To be clear, overall I do really enjoy the show, but in my case I think there are a lot of unforced errors in season 1, and I do still want to talk about them a little bit. For starters, we start with a full episode of Louis in his human life, and this is probably the most in-depth we've ever gotten to see an adaptation go into who Louis is before he's a vampire. It's the first adaptation that includes Louis's brother Paul, which personally I was really excited by because I think Paul plays a huge part in Louis's life and unlife, and he is something that I continually bring up in parts 2 and 3, and I think I even make a call back to him in part 4 of this breakdown. Even here in a 40-minute breakdown of part 1, I spend 3 of those minutes talking about Paul and Louis's regrets regarding him. That said, I am not sure the show could have ever adequately captured Paul or really even understood him, because the show itself is taking a very secular approach to the vampires and their philosophy and all that kind of stuff. And Paul's role in Interview with the Vampire is sort of mystical and religious based. Both how Louis struggles with his Catholicism, and in later installments Lestat struggles with his Catholicism, and I think even Armand, religion is a big thing in his book too, if I'm remembering it correctly from high school. Don't quote me on it. And part of the reason there's all this waffling back and forth about religion is because Anne Rice herself oscillates between being a very devout Catholic and an atheist, and she sort of sees it both ways and has a very nuanced take on the argument and what these perceptions are going to be for someone who is religious versus someone who's secular. All of which makes it very interesting to dive into, and a very detailed, nuanced conversation that starts here in book 1 with Paul. Because Paul might be mentally ill, but he might also really be having a vision from God. And if Louis is to be believed, when he's human, he is a believer, even if he's not as devout as Paul is. And as such, he has been raised to believe in saints and visions and miracles and like spiritual quests from God. With all of that background, he should have agreed with Paul, given him the money, and let him go on his quest. But Louis didn't do that. So then he spends a lot of his life asking why, and sort of coming on the conclusion that it's a form of arrogance, that he had been trained to believe these things and did believe them, but when it was his brother who was the prophet, he just does not care. It's kind of like half implying that Louis thinks Paul was meant for great things and that he is like the evil apostate who stopped him. And maybe like all of history would be different if Paul had gone on his mission. But like this uncertainty of faith in Louis creates a lot of turmoil, both in his decision to turn Paul away, in his hand at Paul's death, and later in his vampiric life about whether or not he's good or evil, what his purpose is in existing and what humanity's purpose is in existing. There are times we catch Louis and he is deep and fervent in his belief with God, and there are times we catch Louis and he is pretty much gone full atheist. And this oscillation, this I believe both at the same time kind of moment, is part of what makes him really compelling and interesting and is like a core aspect of his journey through vampirism. It also affects like how he views fate and all this other stuff. And to be fair to the show, I don't think the showrunners or whoever is working on it are particularly religious. I think they're all very secular and are portraying vampires and magic as sort of like an extension of the natural world. You know, if you don't have that experience or that religiosity in you, I do generally prefer that you don't talk about it. Then including Paul in a whole episode like dedicated to Louis' human life, very weird. It's like, what is the point of Paul anymore? And I think as the season progressed, I probably would have been fine with it if we had come back to Paul, his death, whether or not Lestat has anything to do with Paul's death, all those kind of elements, and re-hit them or like re-tied in some of Louis' interpretation of things as like in correlation to Paul's life and honoring him. There was an opportunity for Louis not to want to eat people because that's something that Paul would have been appalled by. I do talk about it in my episode by episode breakdown, but this TV show version of Louis, it doesn't really make sense for him to have an issue killing and eating humans. It makes more sense if he like only wanted to kill and eat certain kinds of humans, or if he was like, these are the humans who didn't see me as human and now I don't honor their humanity. That's like an option too, like some kind of vengeance tit for tat sort of thing. But since we don't use Paul to explore grief and we don't use Paul to explore Louis' moral compass, it ends up creating a very flawed, sort of troubled image of the man. And it sort of suggests he's all in on the mental illness thing and indirectly implies that religion is like a form of mental illness or a fixation meant for mentally ill people, starting in this time period and apparently moving us through modern day. I don't know. Another thing I found a little bit ironic when it comes to the Paul-Louis Lestat thing, fans for a long time have held that Lestat was possibly, even probably involved in Paul's death. The way those dominoes fall is just very convenient. And when fans have confronted Anne Rice about this potential in the past, she's been really appalled that fans could have read her work and got this potential theory. Which makes it kind of ironic that in show it becomes even more likely that Lestat probably had something to do with Paul's self-harm. And in some ways they make it even more suspicious because even in show Louis is a little bit suspicious of how Paul died and whether or not Lestat was involved. And even though Lestat like genuinely seems horrified and like avidly denies that he was involved, in some ways I just feel like it's even more likely, even more probable that this is a lie and another part of manipulation. Season 1 pretty much covers the entirety of this part 1 of Interview with the Vampire, and I think the way that Daniel works himself in and out doesn't do much for me in this first season, but we see him sort of like come to fruition, the idea of aging him up and making this a second interview in that particular season. But overall, I do feel like Daniel's role in the show is a lot more ambitious than it was in this original book, and that makes sense to me because I think Daniel here is sort of like an audience stand-in. He's here to be amazed, alarmed, to ask a couple obvious questions and get a little of that exposition that Louis might not otherwise provide us, but generally he's supposed to be quiet and like a forgotten presence, and that's something we're really gonna see the further into the book we go, because he just stops interjecting, I think, until part 4 almost. The one thing about the season 1 TV show I loved the most has to be Claudia. I do think she's a little bit in name only as far as characterization goes between what we see here in the book and what you see in the TV show. Utilizing the diary in episode 3 to introduce us to Claudia gives us like a much needed, refreshing, extra perspective. It allows us to be a lot closer to Claudia than we were in the original work, and it adds in like an element of the Gothic, because telling a story through journals is a form of epistolary style that's very common in Gothic literature. It's interesting the show kind of like reverses Anne Rice's premise, where originally Claudia is a 5-year-old girl and grows up into this sophisticated woman but is trapped in that 5-year-old body, where here Claudia is 14 and she forever has like a 14-year-old's impulsiveness, young mind, metabolism, so on and so forth, kind of like clouding her ability to ever grow up. Where on show Lestat's killing feels cruel and evil, Claudia feels like almost fun and obsession driven, and that might just be from framing, because we see Lestat's kill from Louis' POV and sometimes he's in on it, but most of the time he's kind of like horrified, versus we see Claudia's kills from her POV and obviously she just doesn't care that much. It is really interesting because both book Claudia and show Claudia do start killing very erratically, and that pisses Lestat off in both versions. One thing I've always loved about book Claudia is how clever and dangerous and sophisticated she is, and like how deceptive she can be in that 5-year-old body. So seeing her as this chess master that puts Lestat in check, that walks away, that is able to actually construct a plot to kill Lestat that would have been successful had Louis not intervened, is really like very satisfying and almost a full circle moment, given that we know Claudia dies in Act 3. And don't get me wrong, fleeing with the house on fire with Lestat and his new fledgling inside is very metal, and I enjoyed it in book. However, Claudia killing Antoinette and then dipping her quill in Lestat's blood to write his last words is equally metal and like honors Claudia in a way that I don't feel she ever gets full justice in the books. As far as race, gender, sexuality, and some miscellaneous theming stuff we see in season 1 versus the book and the show go in very different directions tackling race, which, you know, self-evident given that Louis in books is a white slave owner and Louis in show is a black pimp. Time periods are also totally different, starting us in 1790s in the book and starting us in 1910 in the TV. In regards to how Interview with the Vampire deals with race, I do feel like it's a little bit a product of its time, doing the best it can at that time. And the thing about being transgressive, being aware, trying to push boundaries is that if you do it right, and if we keep progressing as a society, whatever you did as woke is probably going to be offensive down the line. And that's very much the case for some of how Anne Rice deals with things in the actual book. Like, I do think Anne Rice was trying to do something there, making a white slave owner transformed into a vampire. Like, he's preying on the work and the labor and the lives of these slaves as a human, and now he's like literally preying on the blood of other humans for sustenance. It doesn't quite work out that way as a one-to-one, even though it should. And then on top of that, Louis is like given a for lack of a better term, woke moment when he becomes a vampire, because now he finally realizes that slaves are human beings, and in fact these slaves are potentially way more dangerous and intelligent as far as like their experience with supernatural dark creatures and recognizing the vampires, as well as like eventually the slaves are the ones who get rid of this menace for the good of the town and for the good of themselves. Because there's so much problematic in there and complicated and hard to break apart, which I sort of tackle a little bit within part 1. I'm glad the show doesn't make another pre-Civil War slave-owning white landowner vampire. I don't know that there's really more to say about them. If you want to see like a good breakdown of different pre-Civil War vampires, you can check out Princess Week's video on why we keep making vampires Confederates. She has like a way more nuanced take than the little bit I just dove into here. But as far as how the show tackles race, I'm not like super qualified to explain that or to evaluate it. What I will say is, from the white person's perspective, watching Lestat as the white guy interacting with Louis, he makes me full body cringe all the time. So like minimally, the blindness that Lestat seems to have for Louis's plight, the various blunders he makes in acknowledging and not acknowledging his privilege over Louis, the way Lestat seems so incredibly thin-skinned when people are coming for him, but completely oblivious to when people keep coming for Louis. You know, I have seen people make the modern day equivalent of the blunders Lestat makes, like out of ignorance, out of privilege, out of well-meaning intention gone awry. No matter why it happens or how it happens, it is always super awkward, and that element the show captures perfectly. Bringing me into gender, which is a topic that has always been a bit weird for me in the Vampire Chronicles series, mostly because women are so underrepresented, and when we do get female representation in either vampires or important humans, a lot of times they're depicted in ways that are surprising. And no, I'm not going to get into what I mean by surprising in this, but just know that I'm working on the Vampire Lestat breakdown right now, and we're going to be talking a lot about Gabrielle. But here in Interview with the Vampire, the one major female character is going to be Claudia, and her femaleness is subsumed by the fact that she's trapped in a 5-year-old's body, so like the more pressing issue is that she's a child, not that she's a woman. And as a modern reader, I actually read the plight of Claudia more as like a trans allegory, someone who feels that the body they're in is not the right one and they're not being perceived for who they really are or treated how they feel they should be by society. That's like a trans issue, right? That's not necessarily a woman issue, although certainly women also have issues with being infantilized or being told they can't do things because they're women. You know, when that happens to me, I don't feel body dysmorphia. I still think I'm in the correct body. I just think that person's an ignorant asshole. But aging Claudia in show gives us a really unique perspective. Whether or not you could view a 14-year-old body as an adult is debatable, but the actors who play Claudia are older than 14, and you can definitely view them, even when they're in childish garb, as adults. So since Claudia can pass as an adult, and we do get to see her for 7 years traveling on her own just fine, that lets us tackle some more like woman-coded issues and address her femininity and any oppression she might feel on top of being a Black person. Also like this sexism that also comes with that cross. And it is very interesting to compare and contrast how people deal with Claudia versus how they deal with Louis. They have like that shared struggle of racism, but then sometimes Claudia has these additional expectations or these additional stereotypes that are sort of being foisted upon her that she has to put up with. All of which rolls me into sexuality. While Interview with the Vampire was not consciously written as a gay story, the nature of vampires as sexual creatures, and in particular often queer allegories, combined with the fact that using these time periods means that often you have to choose like male leads as people empowered enough to have a human interesting life before they become vampires, sort of like trends you into a queer narrative just by default. And of course, once Anne Rice got the feedback that people were reading this as a queer relationship, she validates it, and the chronicles go on to make Louis and Lestat's relationship explicitly a same-sex loving relationship, which obviously in this first book you would think that it's like an abusive and toxic relationship, if any kind of relationship at all. And I think season 1 is kind of muddy because it told us that its intention was to show us the romance. And I don't think you can tell the story in the first book and show the romantic element. Like, these two characters do have undeniable chemistry on screen. There are moments that, like, the two actors are truly connecting and creating that longing, pining sort of feeling you're looking for in a Gothic romance. But overall, if you're going to follow even a little bit the events of the original Interview with the Vampire, Lestat is kind of an abusive bitch. And the show actually goes further in that abuse into things that I think are unforgivable unforgivable or minimally unforgivable within the time frame. Because these creatures are vampires, because they survive anything, and because they're immortal, eventually over the span of time, you might come to miss someone, to love them, to forgive them, and maybe even that forgiveness is justified. But we're not given that time span in between violent act and forgiveness for that to be a thing, which really makes this more like a lesson in abuse and toxic relationships, which I am fine with. For the record, my issue is that it's framed as this is a grand romance and then they show me something that's abusive. I wasn't really even certain within the context of this story if Louis loved Lestat, all the way up until the climax of the season where Louis falls back in love with Lestat to trap him, and they have like that really romantic moment, they have the big hunt scene, and as they're about to finally kill Lestat, Louis refuses to let Claudia finish the deed. And that's the closest we come to seeing some of the love and pining that Louis expresses in book, because certainly again, when Claudia first enacts her attempt to kill Lestat, that's when Louis shows like this outpouring of emotion that we're gonna see in parts 2 and 3 of him sort of like pining for Lestat and missing him and like seeing that he had underappreciated him when he'd been in his life. Where the show is currently, I think I am open to a Louis Lestat relationship moving forward, but we'll have to see if that's where the showrunners go with it. And that kind of rolls me into Lestat proper. I know the Lestat defenders hate to hear me say it, but I think he is pure evil and almost unredeemable in show, at least as far as season 1 goes. And in this first book, I actually think that's more or less the same thing going on. The problem these showrunners have with making season 1 so closely aligned to the evil Lestat here is that Lestat becomes the main focal guy for the rest of the Vampire Chronicles. Like, we get one-off books of other vampires telling their stories, but like the majority of the modern day action is always sort of like instigated by Lestat in some shape or form. And to play devil's advocate just a little bit here, even where Lestat is kind of the villain here in Interview with the Vampire, the book, because it's told from Louis' perspective, and Louis makes it more than clear that he has no idea what Lestat is thinking or why he's doing certain things. I think especially when Lestat's father is dying and his father mentions that Lestat was a lover of books, which is 100% contrary to the Lestat Louis knows, Louis begins to realize that he doesn't know this guy at all, like who he is, what he's capable of, what he does or doesn't love. That in a lot of ways Lestat is this mystery to him, and that sort of leaves the door open for Lestat to retell things and like give us extra context and perspective in further installments. But that's like more than enough yapping about the first season of Interview with the Vampire and any additional thoughts of the book. Let me go ahead and kick it back to past Jess. Welcome back to part 2 of Interview with a Vampire. Summarizing, this Interview with a Vampire series is one where I go over each individual part of Interview with a Vampire. We talk about the entire plot, a couple thematic nuances that I noticed while reading, supported by a few quotes here and there. So if you haven't seen part 1, I'd highly recommend it because it's going to summarize the first fourth of this book for you, as well as give you an idea of the kind of themes and things that we're looking for as we move forward in the series. We left them aboard a ship about to sail away to Eastern Europe to try and discover more about the origins of the vampire and what it means to be a vampire. Part 2. So as Claudia and Louis begin their journey to explore for more vampires, Louis remains tense and concerned about Lestat. He doesn't believe for an instant they successfully killed him in the fire. Claudia seems in very high spirits. She's observing passengers, befriending them to get little trinkets, and picking individuals out that she'll be eating later. Happily for these passengers, the ocean liner seems completely devoid of rats. Sadly for these passengers, it seems like there's some kind of strange illness on board. Louis uses this illness to avoid other passengers, claiming he doesn't want to get sick. Louis is concerned that Lestat surviving Claudia's first attempt at murdering him indicates that there's true immortality on the horizon. They will all remain conscious regardless of what state their body is in. But Claudia is a lot more practical. She supposes they dumped Lestat in that murky swamp water. He was able to avoid the sun that way. He rose again, fed off a couple of swamp animals, hitchhiked it back to the local local graveyard, hid in a coffin for the night, fed off some humans, turned the musician, and then came after them that night in their townhouse. Louis is completely dumbfounded that Claudia's been thinking about this that much and that someone could survive the state they saw Lestat in. Claudia kind of shrugs at him and just is like, well, I could have done it. And there's a heavy implication there that Louis could not. He lacks that core will to survive that both Lestat and Claudia share in common. Louis is still worried that absolutely nothing will destroy their consciousness, and he fears the idea of being alive and sentient while he is ashes. Sort of thinks he's being silly and fanciful, and that if they burn the body, there's nothing to rise, and that would be a true death for vampires. Is Louis depressed, and that's why he can't living in the same state that Lestat was? Was Louis privileged by the ease of his human life in a way that both Lestat and Claudia had to struggle, and that's why their will to live seems so much stronger and more intense than Louis's? Is Louis perhaps touching on a core truth about the unconscious, possibly unwilling drive to continue surviving as a vampire? Be true possibly that a vampire or human's consciousness continues as long as their molecules exist somewhere in the ether. So Louis was originally quite excited for this Eastern European journey. He's very hungry for more philosophy, literature, further study. But now that he's undertaking the journey, he's sort of too busy mourning the fact that he's not human going over the sea. He's obsessed with getting that bright blue ocean color you can see in daylight. One night he even takes a lantern and brings it right down towards the sea to see if he can get even a hint of that reflective quality. Some kind of pale imitation of life, or what he imagines this would have been like if he was alive. And of course, this lantern does not illuminate the water as the sun does. Instead of getting that beautiful blue color, he gets this dark, fathomless black, and the light of the lantern comes back up at him like an eye staring into him. No matter where Louis goes or what dreams he fulfills, he's never going to be happy. Louis, your quest is for darkness only. This sea is not your sea. The myths of me are not your myths. Men's treasures are not yours. But oh, how the quest for the old world vampires filled me with bitterness in those moments. For what secret, what truths had those monstrous creatures of the night to give us? His grief for the loss of his human nature increases every single day. He mourns all the little things he could have done as a man and will never be able to do again now that he's a monster. He retells the story of his sister, now elderly, going to visit his grave. Louis wanted to go to her, to comfort her, to tell her he is alive and well, and that she need not feel sorry for him. But Louis refrains because he knows his sister seeing him, youthful as he is now, will drive her mad. He's traveling, looking for a way, hopefully, to end his own existence, even though he knows he'd never have the courage to use it. So here we are dropping anchor in Varna within Eastern Europe, partially because of Dracula myths and all these older, more authentic myths. This is why Claudia picked this spot. Louis describes this old world as dark and beautiful and lonely. He says he and Claudia were in more danger here than they were in New Orleans because they have small villages they're going through where deaths are heavily examined, and because these people are more familiar with vampire mythos, so they're significantly more suspicious of certain kinds of human demise. Finally, one evening, Louis and Claudia find themselves in a village that seems to have been completely shut up. And when they get to the inn, they find the doors surrounded by both crucifixes and garlic, which are common superstitions to deter vampire entry. This gets Claudia really excited and starts to get Louis a little bit intrigued because he feels like something more must be going on in this town. The innkeeper does let them in, but she is very suspicious of them. She probably only allowed them entry because she sees Claudia and believes that she's an innocent child that needs protection. When the two of them get in, they meet Morgan, who is an Englishman in mourning. All of them go to another room where his dead wife is laid out for viewing, and Morgan goes over exactly why they need to leave this cursed land right away and what happened to his wife. He explains that he was an artist, He and his wife were honeymooning here in Eastern Europe because, as an artist, he thought the landscapes here would be incredibly moving. They came out this way to this desolate town because there's a monastery ruins that are pretty well preserved, just a little bit over the rise. And he wanted to paint those ruins and get a good feel for them, as he thought they'd be a beautiful subject matter. They never made it to those ruins, though, because when they got to this town, there was some kind of procession going on, and both Morgan and his wife were really curious about it. They thought it was like a festival or celebration of sorts, and they wanted to witness and partake in some of the quaint local culture they'd been enjoying. The carriage they had rented refused to go into the town, but let them off, and the two of them walked into the village. When they got there, they saw this procession wasn't really like a festival or a celebration. The whole village had gathered to go into the cemetery. And at the cemetery, they have this white horse that they release with a whip to the rear, which runs around the graveyard and stops at this very specific grave. The whole village digs up the grave of this woman who's been dead for about 6 months. And when they open the coffin box, it reveals a perfectly pristine body with no smell of rot or decay and no indication of death at all. It almost looks like she's been buried alive. And so far, Morgan's been a little bit scared. He's held his wife on the outskirts so she can't see exactly what's going on. He's also a little mystified right now, but things start to turn violent at this point, where the villagers stake this corpse through the heart and lop off its head. And then they gather her body to burn it to ashes. And Morgan is terrified by this tradition. He can see the mother of this daughter is weeping and being held back. He has no idea why they're desecrating the corpse this way. The whole thing has really scared him, and he wants to leave now. But no matter how much money he offers any of these people, none of them are willing to take him out of town, and he and his wife Elizabeth have no choice but to stay overnight at the inn. And this is where his wife hears a little bit about the rumors of vampires and their myths and stuff, and she's kind of like tittering and excited about it. So the two of them retire for the night in the inn. Everyone locks the doors up tight. There's all the garlic and crucifixes everywhere. Things should be okay. How did it happen to her? I asked him. I don't know, he gasps, shaking his head, the flask pressed to his forehead as if it were something cool, refreshing, when it was not. It came into the inn? They say she went out to it, he confessed, the tears coursing down his cheeks. Then it was morning, and they were all shouting, and she was gone. Interview with a Vampire, page 178 and 179. So after explaining the death of his wife, Morgan kind of passes out, and the innkeeper comes in and tells Lewis to leave. It's very clear the villagers are nervous about Elizabeth's body being intact, and they plan to stake it and burn it in a similar fashion they did the other lady. And it's equally clear that Morgan does not want this. And Lewis here becomes oddly defensive of Morgan in his passed out, drunken state, and tries to protect Elizabeth and insists that there's no reason to burn her body. Meanwhile, Claudia is pretending to sleep in his arms and sort of whispering to let the village people do whatever. It doesn't even really impact them. Like, why is he endangering them? But if anything, it seems like Claudia telling Lewis to quit it just makes him more desperate to protect Morgan. And this is another great pausing point for us because Lewis claims that his immediate kinship and connection to Morgan comes from the fact that when Morgan asked for his name, he actually gave his real name for the first time in forever, which meant to Lewis that he was known by Morgan, and that gave them an immediate personal connection and brought out Lewis's protective and more human side and his desire to be sort of like a caretaker to Morgan. As he advocates for the dignity of this stranger's dead wife, he actually puts himself and Claudia in danger to do so, elevating Morgan and this dead woman above himself and the daughter that he claims to love and would do anything for. And meanwhile, he doesn't seem to care at all that these villagers have been beset on and attacked by vampires. He's not doing anything to try and protect and help them. He doesn't even feel any kind of plight for the fact that they've been struggling for weeks or possibly months with this fear and this thing preying on them. But this activity is actually very exciting for Louis and Claudia. They now know they're no longer alone, and they might be about to solve the mystery of the vampire. So Louis sort of leaves the inn, gets directions to the monastery, and the two of them just storm off to meet this vampire. Claudia herself is nothing but eagerness incarnate, and Louis is very fearful and hesitant, although he doesn't do a very good job describing why. It's just kind of like this amorphous terror. And for the first time, the two of them meet a vampire just cresting the slope with another unconscious human victim on their shoulder. I held fast to Claudia, ready in an instant to shove her behind me, step forward and meet him. But then I saw with astonishment, and his eyes did not see me as I saw him. Page 187, Interview with a Vampire. This is a not-so-friendly meeting of a new and strange vampire. The first thing it does is try to attack and kill Louis. And as this attack's happening, Louis realizes that the coat is torn and rotting, that there's nothing behind the eyes. This thing really seems more like a shambling zombie or a mindless creature than it does a vampire, as both he and Claudia are. And for a minute, things are really quite worrisome for Louis, and then Claudia comes in like a badass and starts pelting this thing with stones. Once it's distracted, Louis gets his hand on this thing's hair and just bashes its face into the floor until it finally stops. And then while Louis is catching his breath and taking stock of things, Claudia jumps on top of this vampire and takes pieces of its skull and starts scattering it around so it won't be able to rise again. The European vampire, the creature of the old world. He was dead. Interview with a Vampire, page 188. So in a surprise twist, that human victim the vampire was carrying is Morgan. And he recognizes Louis and calls out to him, and this just tortures Louis's poor heart, and he flees the scene. Claudia tries to call to him, tries to show him reason. In the end, she drinks from Morgan and then chases after Louis, trying to get him to come back and feed since he hasn't for the night yet. And dawn is happening quickly. But Louis ignores Claudia, drags her back to the carriage, shoves her up there, and starts running those horses as fast as he can. Gets to the inn, he sort of storms on in there with the crucifix the lady gave him. It says that he had killed the vampire, gets them to bring the stuff up to his room, and gets them a safe place to stay for the evening. Once in the room, Claudia offers him her wrist and tries to get him to feed from her because he's going to starve otherwise for the night. And Louis kind of like shrugs her off and is like, I'm gonna do the same thing I've done for a while now. And he just like shoves his hand into a wall and grabs out a rat. Unclear if this is Louis's imagination, but he has like these series of visions that include Claudia as an adult, sort of like embracing him, and the two of them safely retire for the evening. And while this is not the first time that Louis has been highly imaginative in the book or been prone to some kind of extreme flight of fancy, it does seem like Louis is less able to discern reality and his hallucinations, getting more intense and more prevalent. Now Louis and Claudia continue their journeys in Eastern Europe as vampire hunters. They're welcomed in their towns, they meet many more Eastern vampires, and all of them are similar to this first meeting. Sometimes they kill them like they did him, and sometimes they just watch them from afar. The closest they ever get to meeting a freshly raised vampire is a woman who had just been a few months dead, and Louis describes their meeting this way. In one hamlet, it was a woman, only dead for perhaps a few months. The villagers had glimpsed her and knew her by name. It was she who gave us the only hope we were to experience after the monster in Transylvania. And that hope came to nothing. She fled for months through the forest and we ran after her, reaching out to her long black hair. Her white burial gown was soaked with dried blood, her fingers caked with dirt of the grave. And her eyes, they were mindless, empty, two pools that reflected the moon. No secrets, no truths, only despair. Interview with a Vampire, page 193. How did these others exist, and why are they so different than them? Louis is less concerned about the how and more concerned about why are they so different than he and Claudia. And he sort of begins to worry that he and Claudia killed the only other sentient vampire in existence, possibly that Lestat knew some kind of secret mojo that made him and Claudia different than these other Eastern European vampires. And Louis uses this discovery about these vampires as another way for him to fall into a funk about Lestat's death. He's really in his head about Lestat. He even feels like Lestat has just left rooms, or like he can barely make out Lestat's laughter. The good times between he, Lestat, and Claudia sort of run in a loop, and he's basically being haunted by his creator. Meanwhile, Claudia is busy trying to figure out why these vampires are so different. She supposes that if Louis and Lestat had turned her, and then instead of letting her wake up and exist as she was allowed, they put her in a box and buried her underground. By the time she broke out to the surface, the starvation, the isolation, the strain would have snapped her mind, and she might be a mindless eating thing the same way these creatures are. An experience like that would break anyone's mind. And this sort of gets Claudia fixated again on the idea of turning and what it takes to turn another creature. She again wonders why Louis can't make a vampire as Lestat. Horrified as Louis, he never wants to do that or even try. And she sort of taunts him a little bit with this information. She wonders exactly how much blood it would take to resurrect someone. She speculates idly that perhaps Louis has accidentally turned vampires before. Maybe he even left some monsters similar to those they're seeing now. Would he have left a drop of his blood on a victim or two before? Would that have been enough? And Louis himself was a bunch of conflicted emotions over this. He realizes part of the reason he's so upset by Claudia bringing up the idea he might be capable of turning someone is that it's something he sort of subconsciously considered with Babette all those years ago. But as lonely as he was, as much as he admired and loved her, he could never turn her. And this can help us draw some conclusions about how Louis, Lestat, and Claudia all view vampiric existence. Lestat sees vampirism as a gift, Claudia seems to see it as a mystery, and Louis sees it as a curse. And this is kind of interesting for us to ponder or talk about further because all three of these vampires live in extreme loneliness and isolation. And all of them see creating more vampires as a solution to this loneliness. Family ghosts. I tell you that as much as I hated Lestat, she stopped. Yes, I whispered. Yes. As much as I hated him, with him we were complete. Interview with a Vampire, page 196. Since they've been traveling abroad, there's been a lot of strain in their relationship, possibly since Claudia actually went through with killing Lestat and Louis turned away from her for the first time. Louis is sitting in his resentment, maintaining silence, sort of trying to pretend nothing is wrong. And Claudia has kept trying to find a way forward. She knows there's something that's not right and isn't quite sure how to piece it back together. But Louis isn't ready to face his feelings. Possibly he'll never be ready. But his inability to face how he feels about Claudia in the wake of her attack on Lestat is perhaps similar to how Claudia doesn't face how she might feel about Louis participating in her murder and turning. The two no longer confide or trust one another as they used to. And their different approaches when it comes to mending this rift is actually driving them further apart instead of helping them come together and find common ground. Neither can be what the other needs right now, and we're really in the beginning of seeing their relationships decline. And Claudia sort of announces they've found everything there is to see here in Eastern Europe, and they're going to skip their planned tour and go right to Paris. I tell you, I begin to understand that we have done it all wrong from the start. We need our language, our people. I want to go directly to Paris. Page 198, Interview with a Vampire. And with that, Claudia and Louis are on their way out of Paris, and we're here at the end of part 2. I have a few closing meta thoughts for you to consider on your way out to get you prepped for where we're going in part 3. First of all, what do you think is behind Claudia's decision to go directly to Paris? Does she just believe the two need to change? Does she believe the plans she had set are not working? Is she trying to please Louis, who longs to go to Paris and would have wanted to go there from the first? Does she just believe that they've seen all there is to see from the Eastern European vampires? And also, I want to take a moment and pause with some potential racial bias here in the text. Louis seems to connect more easily with humans that he sees are like him, specifically white, well-off, and preferably male, or having a male-coded thinking process. The travels of Louis and Claudia to Eastern Europe reference Bram Stoker's Dracula, and the original novel explores cultural differences between Englishmen and Eastern Europeans, as well as possible cultural and racial tensions. And I feel like Interview with a Vampire is trying to echo some of those in its own way here. Specifically, it's exploring the idea of what it means to be separate or other, both like a vampire human or different human cultures, how that would translate over from human life to a vampiric life. Something being different makes it an other and makes you fear it or be suspicious of it or have less empathy for it. And I think both of these stories do a good job highlighting how tribalism within humans create this fear of the other and sometimes set humanity against itself when really they should be rallying together and all the other things they have that's so much more in common to fight whatever the vampire or the supernatural threat is within the story. Here with Louis, he identifies with Morgan, who's the Englishman. He doesn't seem to identify with the innkeeper or a single other Eastern European person he meets. Claudia is the one who says that they need our language and our people, but Louis has been longing for this cultural home and holding Paris up as like this glowing beacon or symbol since the very beginning. So that leaves us asking, is some of this racially motivated? Is there unconscious bias at play in Louis's mindset? Is this more of a looking for your roots kind of thing or finding your heritage kind of thing? What exactly do you think about these prose, what they're trying to get across, what might have been intentional or unintentional? Tell me about it in those comments down below. And how do you think any of this might call back when we watch Interview with the Vampire Season 1? Only get to see some more diverse casting going on. I want to thank you guys for coming with me on this ride in part 2. It's a little bit shorter than part 1, but strap in because part 3 is going to be long and intense and go on forever if my notes are anything to go by. Part 2 of this book is really short, and it was very interesting that we actually cover it in show first episode of season 2 because it is only 42 pages long, and what we discover when we're traveling abroad before we get to Paris is like an aspect of vampirism that Anne Rice never touches again and really isn't like very important in the grand scheme of the Vampire Chronicles. So even though it feels like a really fun like homage to Dracula, to that sort of like origin of the vampire story and various incarnations of vampire lore and like small villages dealing with vampires, it doesn't like matter in the larger scope of the chronicles and often is just sort of blocking us from getting to like that really epic scene at the end of part 3. But that said, because the show started us off in 1910 and we're actually in the middle of a war-torn Europe when Claudia and Louis go there in show, there is definitely a lot more interesting visuals on display for us here. Like seeing them pick across war fields looking for loot or like still living corpses they can feed from, all good stuff. And also because Claudia and Louis are Black and they're traveling through Europe at a time where there's not really any tourism going on because there's a war, there's like this heavy outsider implication going on here that makes them set like apart from everybody else they'll meet and makes people just generally suspicious of them being here. I also really like this episode because it does a good job showing that killing Lestat is a poison between the two of them, which is very true in book and here in show as well. And two, season 1 had done such a great job showing that like bound together in hatred element where vampires cannot stand to be together with their makers for long, but also they cannot stand to be without each other in isolation, which is something I feel like Claudia and Louis learn in part 2 and 3 of the book, so them having this one sort of like callback scene of mutual hatred, but also in particular Claudia like despising Louis, but also being completely incapable of leaving him, despite the fact she spent 7 years on her own and doesn't like need him to survive, is all great, interesting stuff, giving us all the emotions and like Gothic elements that I'm looking for in a vampire flavored thing. I also love this episode is labeled "What Can the Damned Really Say to the Damned?" because it echoes Book Louis's discontent in being a vampire. Now getting to travel the world as he kind of always dreamed to do, but because he's doing it as a vampire instead of as a mortal, he feels like it's entirely meaningless and wrong, and like there's nothing that he can enjoy or gain from these travels. Of course, here in show it has a slightly different meaning, again, like highlighting the fact that Claudia and Louis, while traveling together, are still not even really speaking, because what can the two of them have to say to each other after the travesty that was the attempted murder of Lestat? And I do love the use of the Lestat hallucination throughout season 2, because Book Louis is often imagining Lestat is still with them, or he's imagining how Lestat would respond to things, or he's even like sort of thinking that he can hear his laughter in the air. And the hallucination is a great like manifestation of that for us. The old world vampires Claudia and Louis eventually discover are not like they are in the book, but I think that makes sense because this book version is sort of like odd and never comes up again in Chronicles. I miss that we didn't get some of the action intensity that we get in part 2, but Louis and Claudia do still fight a vampire together, and we do still get a little bit of that action scene, and I think we're compensated a little bit by meeting this super old vampire that's trying to make these vampires that are coming out like wretched and wrong. Claudia like reaches out to her like, travel with us, we'll be companions together, you can teach us things, and we can figure out what's going wrong that you can't make other vampires anymore. And for a minute it looks like she's going to agree, and then she throws herself in a fire. Like that conscious, willful decision to self-immolate rather than joining them or being alone, that her existence has been so insufferable she'd rather burn alive than continue it. That's a pretty bleak and grim message for these two vamps. Probably on par with the message that Louis takes away from like the slavering vampires that can't string a sentence together. I do kind of wish the show hadn't incorporated the character of Morgan. They do it in a very altered state here. Morgan within the text here means something and further shows like Louis choosing humanity over Claudia, further alienating himself from her, and like further standing strong in his resolution that vampirism is evil and that humans are good and that he should like defend the good old boys club or whatever. And here it's like him choosing Claudia over humanity and separating himself, which makes sense for where this season's story is going, but is kind of like you could have done this in a different way, or you could have not incorporated Morgan specifically into it. But that's more than enough conversation from me for now. I'm going to kick it back to past Jess. Welcome to Interview with a Vampire Part 3. This Interview with a Vampire series is going over the entire plot of everything Interview with a Vampire. I've broken it into parts, so go ahead and start at the beginning with part 1 to see what happened there. The quickest of recaps of where we left off. At the end of part 2, we traipsed all across Eastern Europe. We'd met some vampires and it had been anticlimactic. And now Claudia and Louis are going to Paris.
Part 3.
I think the very name of Paris brought a rush of pleasure to me that was extraordinary, a relief so near to well-being that I was amazed. Not only that I could feel it, but that I'd also nearly forgotten it. Interview with the Vampire, page 201. Louis waxes on poetically for a long time about how much he loves Paris, how nobody else could ever understand how he felt or why he felt that way, and how he would never feel that way again, even if he returns to Paris now. But both Louis and Claudia seem to fall in love with Paris at first sight. They rent a room at the Hotel Saint-Gabriel, and they spare no expense in decorating and furnishing it. Claudia drops a ton of money on the room, the decor, a a whole new wardrobe, going to all of the latest shows. Lewis acknowledges her general frustration that she has to take all of her requests through him to get things. But he never really confronts or addresses the problem in a way that seems 100% satisfactory to Claudia, even though he is getting her all the things she asks for. And Lewis does compare a lot of Claudia's extravagance to that of Lestat, and in many ways this is sort of the largest death sentence he can give his and Claudia's relationship. Lewis still believes that Lestat chose and kept him specifically for his money and his financial liberties, and Lewis has always jealously guarded those finances. And Lewis disparaged a lot of Lestat's character through his love of extravagance and wealth and gauche poor taste. Claudia's love of the finer things in life would have eventually led Lewis to despise her in much the same way he hated Lestat. And if we do just like a little bit of background digging in Lewis's life, we can see that he has always really idolized characters who live frugally. Like Lewis highly values his brother, spends all of his time praying and meditating in the oratory. And even though Lewis loved his mother and sister, he did consider all of their parties and social gatherings sort of like a silly little thing he overlooked. And the second Lewis's brother wants any money to become a saint or to help convert France or whatever, he dies. So it seems like there's a direct correlation to being frugal equaling good and wanting money for any reason being bad. And it seems like Lewis can't help but value frugality and resent anyone who wants to live with more than just what they need. But something was wrong. It was not the old serenity, the pensiveness that was recollection. There was a brooding there, a smoldering dissatisfaction. And though it would vanish from her eyes when I would call to her or answer her, anger seemed to settle very near the surface. Page 204, Interview with a Vampire. While Lewis and Claudia are both re-energized by Paris, it does not solve all. Lewis seems to be fixated on all the ways Claudia is like Lestat. And Claudia is busy dealing with her own childish visage and what that means for her in her immortality. Both of them retreat further into their own woes instead of confiding in one another. All of which boils over into a massive fight between Lewis and Claudia, where Claudia is venting her frustration at how she will always appear a child and never be a grown woman. And it seems to me that Lewis just wants to move on with life. He doesn't understand why this is such a big deal or why they have to keep talking about it. And eventually Claudia suggests that perhaps people don't see her as a child anymore, but they see her as a little person. And she does it in this sort of derogatory, unkind manner that causes Lewis just to explode with rage and to claim that he has no culpability in this situation and the whole thing is not his fault. And what do you even want him to do? And that's when Claudia stops him and asks him what sex was like, which is a huge transgression of their relationship. It's not something that seems to have ever come up before, and from this point forward in the novel, there'll be a lot more sexual innuendo and implications. It was something hurried, I said, trying now to meet her eyes. How perfectly, coldly blue they were. How earnest. And it was seldom savored. Something acted that was quickly lost. I think that it was a pale shadow of killing. Ah, she said, like hurting you as I do now. That is also a pale shadow of killing. Yes, madam, I said to her. I am inclined to believe that is correct. And bowing swiftly, I bade her good night. Interview with a Vampire, page 207. Are killing and sex linked in Lewis's mind specifically because of the guilt he seems to carry over both acts? Does the comparison stand outside of Lewis's terminology? Does this shine a light on any of Lestat's, Lewis's, or Claudia's kills? So Lewis is out for a midnight stroll, basically to escape Claudia, and he's wandering down the path just kind of being his usual tortured self when he can hear some footsteps that are exactly in tempo with his, which means to him that it's not a mortal following him, but a vampire. The vampire eventually reveals themselves, does a fun little mimicry trick that Louis does not take kindly to. He makes fun of this vampire, they start to get into an altercation, and another vampire comes in between them and hands a card to Louis, inviting him to the Théâtre des Vampires, or the Theater of Vampires. Apology for butchering that and continuing to butcher it. The next evening, both Louis and Claudia attend the Théâtre des Vampires. All the other patrons are human, and Louis is beginning to think that maybe this is a bust when the show starts, and he realizes that all of the actors on the stage are actually vampires. They take a young, innocent, and terrified human woman, they throw her up on the stage, and she's basically begging for her life. One of the vampires takes on the persona of death and forces her to debate whether or not she's worthy of life. And eventually they overpower her and kill her on stage. It's a little bit unclear if the humans who are watching this are aware that this is an actual death or if they believe this is some form of performance. It is an invite-only theater, so it's possible that these are just people who enjoy this kind of thing. Humanity's general love of blood sport. Whether people come to watch some sort of gallows execution or they're going to a movie theater full of blood and gore, what draws people to seeing this kind of violence portrayed on the screen? I felt the anger in my veins as sure as the passion. With a bowed head, she bore the whole responsibility for defending life. And it was unfair, monstrously unfair, that she should have to pit logic against him for what was obvious and sacred and beautifully embodied in her. I could feel her dying inside, weakening, and I hated him. Page 220, Interview with the Vampire. While Louis is watching this, he is a riot of contradictions. He's horrified for this young girl. He feels generally terrible that this is happening to her. He wants to save and protect her. And at the same time, he is intensely jealous of the other vampires on the stage and wishes more than anything that he was up there killing her. Very similar to what we see when he originally meets Claudia as a human, and both wants to comfort that child and protect the child and wants to drain her dry. I wanted to cry out to her, to break her swoon. And I wanted her. Wanted her as he was moving in on her. Page 222, Interview with a Vampire. Louis never learns what Claudia feels about this performance or much else going forward. She becomes a strangely silent and pensive figure from here on out, and this does make it a little bit hard for us as readers going forward because Louis makes much ado about nothing all the time, and we really needed either Claudia or Lestat's take on things to sort of better ground us and realize whether or not this was like a huge deal or like just something that Louis was all gung-ho about. Finally meeting Armand. He was that auburn hair vampire that gave us the card to the theater in the first place. He's very still and pale. He looks no older than 15, but we find out that he's actually lived about 400 years as a vampire, and he claims to be the oldest living vampire. He seems to be detached from everything and everyone, and something about him just draws Louis magnetically to him. For his part, Armand also seems quite fascinated by Louis. So Armand basically takes Louis and Claudia on a tour. They see the crypts with a ton of artwork. They meet this mortal boy who likes to have his blood drained from him, and they both drink from him and leave him alive. Armand pulls them away from the public rooms and takes them to his private study for a more personal chat. Claudia sits in like this dazed silence, and Louis answers questions while he is like half hypnotized by this devil painting in the room. Almost flies into one of his like hallucinogenic flights of fancy, but it doesn't quite go that far. Although he never seems to get like a solid ground under his feet during any of this conversation. How each time he spoke, he seemed to arise out of a state of contemplation, very like the state which I now felt I was drifting, from which it took so much to wrench myself. And yet he never moved, and seemed at all times alert. This distracted me, while at the same time I was powerfully attracted by it, as I was by this room, its simplicity, its rich, warm combination of essentials. The books, the desk, the 2 chairs by the fire, the coffin, the pictures. The luxury of those rooms in the hotel seemed vulgar, but more than that, meaningless besides this room. Page 231, Interview with a Vampire. And this is where we learn about that aesthetic austerity that both Louis and Armand seem to have in common. This desire to have no more than they need, to learn and to be creatures of the mind that seems to connect the two of them very intimately in a way that Lestat and Claudia can never quite compete with. But I understood something else now as they looked at each other. He, devoid of the habit of human gesture rooted in necessity, ritual, fluctuation of mind, and his stillness now was unearthly. And she, as I'd never seen before, possessed the same stillness. And they were gazing at each other with a preternatural understanding from which I was excluded. Page 239, Interview with a Vampire. And this is another occasion where Louis notes he and Claudia are not really that similar. Claudia's search for my own kind that excludes him. This sameness between her and Armand. They have this vampire essence that Louis believes he lacks, that perhaps he even aspires to or shuns. It's hard to say which. It feels like both, depending on his mood. It seems to make him quite jealous that all these other beings have it and he does not. So Armand wants to know where Louis and Claudia came from, and Louis and Claudia don't want to tell him because they're kind of afraid to tell him about Lestat. Armand pushes the two and they get into this side tangent about the nature of good and evil and whether vampires could be good or evil and whether God or the devil exists, and if so, what that would or wouldn't mean for humanity. And this is where Louis sort of takes his stand because he is so concerned about the concepts of good and evil and upholding goodness wherever and however he can, despite the fact that he believes that as a vampire he is a damned and evil thing. And he basically says that whether or not there's a god or a devil, it doesn't matter. Life and consciousness is the ultimate good. So the only evil thing one can do in the world is to destroy that life or consciousness. Vampires, a being that can only survive by preying on that lifeblood and consciousness and thought and goodness, must be evil since they're snuffing those things out one at a time. And saying all this out loud is too much for Louis, and he has a peak emo doesn't belong kind of moment where he storms out of the office and goes to sit alone. And while he's sitting at the theater sort of thinking about Lestat, apologizing out loud to him, waxing on melancholy and sad as Louis does, this other vampire, the one that he mocked in the street and that sort of like followed him around, his name is Santiago, comes up to him and strikes up a conversation. But Louis does not like this vampire and is super sus of him, which, to be fair, the feeling is mutual. But before things can go too far, Armand kind of pops out of a bush, breaks the two up. He gets really close to Louis and whispers to him to watch out for Santiago, basically to reveal nothing of their past and speak nothing at all of their maker. We are finally introduced to this vampire troupe, and Louis observes an inhuman but vaguely similar element to all these vampires. And it seems like this isn't 100% by nature, but also by design, because all the vampires are wearing black. Later learns that all the vampires except for Armand are dyeing their hair black, and he sees that these vampires are just trying their hardest to embody death. Claudia asks these vampires, so what's up with those vampires in Eastern Europe? And Armand is familiar with these vampires and immediately begins to talk about them, and he wants to say something to Claudia and Louis about them. But one of the other vampires in the troupe sneers at him and interrupts him, and that sort of shuts Armand down. And we don't get an answer in this book, but I'm going to keep it in my hat. Wonder if there is more origin information available about these Eastern European vampires. Claudia then asks if there's anything taboo in vampire society, and there's some jokey moments there. Santiago comes in and says the only thing illegal in vampire society is killing another of their kind, which everyone gets really quiet about, and they kind of all stare intently at Claudia and Louis because they don't know what's going on with those two, but their master's not with them, so that's kind of weird. And Claudia makes a joke, and both she and Louis leave them to go back to the hotel. A couple random character things we learned in these conversations. Louis was jealous of how close the other vampires seemed to be with Armand. He was also surprised that he was jealous of those other vampires. And Louis had an opportunity to see his own treatment of Claudia mirrored by these other vampires. He sort of like fawned over her and treated her like a child, even though she has the intelligence and cunning of a woman. And he wonders to himself how often he's made the same mistake. And the last thing we take away from this is that Louis sort of sees humanity as the highest form. Vampires are surrounded by all these great works of art, but they have created none of them. And they have no original thoughts or creativity of their own. They claim humanity is the more depraved because if you can think it, then you can do it. And all the artwork that they have around them is of death and like horrible end times, angels and demons kind of fights. But the fact that humans seem to be capable of art, emotion, philosophy, wisdom, are all things that Louis values, while this stagnation and call to uniformity these other vampires have going on sort of repel Louis and make him realize just how horrible vampirism is. It's probably the least surprising twist that when Louis and Claudia finally get to meet and interact with other vampires, they hate them. It might even be a competition whether or not they hate these vampires more than they hated Lestat. At least in Louis's case, we know he's got like some kind of fond hindsight vision of Lestat that he kind of loves. And also Claudia worries that that vampire troupe will find out what she did to Lestat. And Louis quickly corrects her with what they did to Lestat. And this causes a whole side spiral where Claudia and Louis argue about what binds them together, whether or not Louis actually loves Claudia as he claims, or whether or not he is just afraid, and that's why the two of them cling to each other. You would leave me for Armand if he beckoned you. Never, I said to her. You would leave me, and he wants you as you want him. He's been waiting for you. Page 247, Interview with a Vampire. This argument between Louis and Claudia is quite interesting. Does Armand want Louis all for himself, or could it be the three of them as it was once Louis, Lestat, and Claudia? Would Louis ever leave Claudia for Armand? Would Armand actually do something to Claudia to get her out of the way? Is Armand capable of the mental communication or the life-draining elements that Claudia sort of is implying? So the next evening, Louis goes to speak to Armand. He witnesses a moment between Armand and the boy that's very tender and loving and sort of further confuses him. But eventually Armand tucks that boy in and the two of them get to talking. So Armand doesn't care about the how or why of Louis and Claudia. He's just super stoked to be with Louis. But the others are a little less forgiving, and Louis and Claudia are in some real danger. That the vampires of the world are a small number and live in terror of strife among themselves and choose their fledglings with great care, making certain that they respect other vampires mightily. There are 15 vampires in this house, and the number is jealously guarded. And weak vampires are feared. I should say that this also, that you are flawed, is obvious to them. You feel too much, you think too much. As you said yourself, vampire detachment is of no great value to you. And then there's the mysterious child, a child who can never grow, never be self-sufficient. I would not make a vampire of that boy there now if his life, which is so precious to me, were in serious danger, because he is too young, his limbs not strong enough, his mortal cup barely tasted. Yet you bring with you this child. What manner of vampire makes her, they ask. Did you make her? So, you see, you bring with you these flaws and this mystery, and yet you are completely silent. And so you cannot be trusted, and Santiago looks for an excuse. But there's another reason closer to the truth than all those things which I've just said to you, and that is simply this. That when you first encountered Santiago in the Latin Quarter, you, unfortunately, called him a buffoon. Page 250, Interview with a Vampire. So Louis longs to confide in Armand. He struggles to understand the other vampires' need to conform. He regrets judging Lestat and condemning him. He wants to confront Armand about Claudia's fears, but is too afraid to do that because it would break Claudia's confidence. And Armand, for his part, counsels Louis to avoid the other vampires because his face just gives everything away. Louis asks Armand just to stop the others so they can all hang out. And Armand says he doesn't have the power to do that, or more accurately, he doesn't want to employ the amount of energy and power it would take to maintain that kind of control. And that's when Louis realizes all he really wants to do is just sit in Armand's room, be with him forever. He sees Armand as exactly the kind of teacher he wanted, that Lestat was unable to be, and he feels he could spend lifetimes learning with Armand and traveling across the world to see new things. But Louis can't stay here with Armand because Claudia is waiting for him at home. And this is where resentment about his role with Claudia starts to seep into Louis. So Louis goes back to the Hotel St. Gabriel. Madeleine, a woman with red hair and violet eyes, sits waiting for him, and she asks to be turned into a vampire. Louis can see that Claudia's already got the 2 puncture wounds here, but unfortunately, because she is so small, she's not able to transform Madeleine on her own and needs Louis to do it for her. Louis is appalled at the prospect of turning Madeleine, or anyone ever. Claudia screams at him, says she hates him, says she needs this, says she's fighting for her life between her and Armand. And she says, like, the 2 of them, Louis and Claudia, are a broken couple, and maybe adding this 3rd stabilizing factor, Madeleine, will make things better. But even if it doesn't, it will give Louis a chance to be free to hang out with Armand, and Claudia will still have someone to help her through this world. And through all this guilt and bullying and pretension, and perhaps genuine feeling on Claudia's part, she's able to convince Louis to reluctantly turn Madeleine. And though Louis is soft-spoken and patient with Madeleine, guiding her through all the steps of becoming a vampire and her initial first days as a vampire, he is also very detached and emotionally removed from the couple. And Louis sort of claims that he lost his humanity or his ability to feel deeply when he turned her. As a vampire, Madeleine is vicious and mad. She burns down her old dollmaker shop. She kills so many people that Louis has to literally drag her away because she can't consume any more blood than she already has. And she has this feral intensity and desire to create. She makes a whole world for her and Claudia where everything is sized down to be a perfect miniature for Claudia. So she has a perfect sized bed. All the paintings in the room are hung up at Claudia's eyeline. It's this beautiful little fairy world where Louis believed that Madeleine would eventually have to face the reality of the world and what she was and the change that has happened. Madeleine is busy creating her own world so that what she believes can be dominant. And it's a very happy bubble for Claudia and Madeleine to be in. And it's a few days into this new world order that Armand appears in front of Louis and sort of spirits him away. Louis, for his part, has been avoiding Armand because he was afraid that this death of emotion meant he'd no longer be attracted to Armand. And if he doesn't ever see the guy, he doesn't have to acknowledge that this is his new normal. But luckily, when he sees Armand and when the 2 are alone together, huge love and magnetism and pull between the 2 of them still there, and Louis is keenly relieved. So Louis makes some awkward small talk for a while, which is quintessentially human. And Armand responds by sort of like transitioning them into some vampire lessons that Louis has always wanted. You really have no need of the rooms you have at the hotel. You really have need of very little. But each of us must decide how much we want. Interview with a Vampire, page 278. So Armand and Louis bond over how much they're both on the same page about like a proper lifestyle. There is an immense similarity between the 2 when they talk about personal physical comforts. And this similarity sort of highlights how differently the 2 of them view humanity and morality as a whole. While Armand just seems detached and passive and like discomfort doesn't bother him, like he's beyond that, it seems more to me like Louis welcomes discomfort as part of like a punishment for being this evil immortal being. So then Armand starts stating some facts. That Claudia now has a new guardian, that Louis can leave her, that Louis wants to be with Armand. Louis, for some reason, is still staying with Claudia and Madeleine. And Louis blusters a little bit and explains how he isn't a paramour to Claudia. He's Claudia's father. Daughters can't discharge their father. Fathers are responsible for their daughters until they die. Except he stutters on the dying part because Louis is never going to die. And Claudia is never going to die. So is he going to remain at Claudia's side as a father forever? And Armand explains to Louis that he doesn't believe it's this father-daughter thing that's keeping them together. He thinks that letting Claudia go would symbolize Louis releasing the end of an era for him. And that vampires as immoral beings have to find ways to mark time and to keep up with human culture and society. Claudia, for him, was one way that he was marking time and finding his peace and his place in society bearable. Even if it's a natural parting, does that mean that he's losing what made life worth living or continuing on in this vampiric sense? And Louis sort of says, like, oh, vampires must do this all the time, going from one era to the next. And Armand goes on to explain that no, actually they don't. A lot of vampires don't survive the end of their era or many eras after that because they have to keep finding like new tokens or connections or elements. Otherwise they get trapped in like the sameness of immortality and they basically just fade away. Armand then goes on to talk about his maker, his extreme love for his maker, his mortal life in Venice, how his maker loved him so much he turned him into a vampire, how he views his immortality and vampirism as a gift. It's quite sweet. He's completely shocked when Louis says that his maker held no love for him and he sort of hates Lestat, that Lestat turned him just for money, and can you imagine only being wanted for material reasons? And it's through this conversation that Armand and Louis realize that there's a mutual need between them. Louis needs Armand as a mentor and a steadying figure in his life. And Armand needs Louis to be his 19th century era. And Louis explains that Armand is terribly mistaken. Louis feels out of place and out of step everywhere he goes and around everyone, and that he's disappointed everyone he truly loves. And Armand laughs at him. That out of place feeling is what everybody feels in this time. Louis is this century's lonely, broken heart. And as for the vampires at the Théâtre du Vampire, they reflect the age and cynicism which cannot comprehend the depth of possibilities, fastidious, sophisticated indulgence, and the parody of the miraculous decadence whose last refuge is self-ridicule, a mannered helplessness. Interview with a Vampire. Louis warns Armand that how he feels is torture and that no one would want to feel as difficultly as he does. Armand agrees that he doesn't understand how Louis feels and begs him to start giving him those details about his and Claudia's relationship so he can understand better. So Louis talks about how hard it was for him to turn Madeleine and how he thinks that he's betrayed his one unifying principle and how it almost shattered any humanity he had left in him, and that Louis is still trying to come to terms with his own self-betrayal. And Armand tells him, hey buddy, don't worry about it because I compelled you to turn Madeleine. I saw an opportunity. She's the right caretaker for Claudia. If you wouldn't have done it, I would have done it, but I thought you'd want a part in it, so I just gave you that little mental push, which makes Louis feel terrible and a little bit annoyed. And he tells Armand that he can never do that kind of thing to him again. Notably, Armand does not commit to one way or the other. Louis desperately wants to be with Armand, gives him the push to go back to the Hotel Saint Gabriel one more time and have his goodbye to Claudia. When he returns to the hotel, Claudia greets him and says that he's been with Armand and that he wants to be with Armand. Louis, for his part, finally doesn't deny this. And he asks Claudia if she will be alright on her own with Madeleine. Claudia is confident she and Madeleine will be fine and asks Louis if he's sure, if he wouldn't like to stay with them. Does he even really know what he's signing up for with this Armand character? Louis says he's good, he loves Armand. He's gonna be with him forever. And Claudia's like, well, you're making a mistake, and I just hope me and Madeleine can come back for you when you realize that. But until then, I wish you the best. And they are sort of holding each other and having perhaps the most beautiful and sweet moment of the book, where they're still not quite communicating correctly. Each one is worried for the other, convinced they know better, thinks the other is the one that's going to fail. Even as they're expressing this, they're sort of putting it aside so they can have this one last moment and acknowledgement of all the time they had together. So of course, this is when the Théâtre des Vampires plans its surprise attack. Louis shoves Claudia out the door, and then he bars the entrance, and he just fights like a madman, just determined to protect Claudia and to make this last stand. He doesn't know how or when, but there's just too many vampires. They overpower him. Madeleine's over there in a corner crying, and they get a hold of Claudia as well and drag all of them back to the theater. And when they get to the theater, who should be there but Lestat? That is the vampire who will not die. Here, demanding vengeance on Claudia for attempting to murder him. He wants Louis to come back with him, to live with him, to help take care of him until he regains his strength at least, but potentially forever. Meanwhile, Louis is begging Lestat to tell them the truth, to explain to them Claudia doesn't know better, to know that they were treated poorly, that this was the only way for them to escape. And when that's not working, he's begging Lestat, saying he'll come back with him willingly if they'll just let Claudia go. Just protect Claudia. And all this time in Louis's head, he's calling for Armand. He's thinking if he just stalls long enough, Armand will come in and save them all. But this Lestat-Louis scene has to eventually shatter. Santiago comes in, breaks the conversation up, comes out with this iron casket, and that's when Louis realizes what his fate will be. And he struggles for dear life at this moment, but they manage to force him into the casket, to lock him in there. And then they drag him down, bury him, and then break up the burial where they placed him, because they want Louis to go crazy in isolation, starved from everything. And Louis is just trying to keep it together once he's trapped in the coffin, thinking like any moment now Armand will stop this. And if Armand doesn't come back tonight, he'll come back tomorrow and he'll find me and save us all back. And he just keeps thinking about this in his head. But even as he's thinking it, he also has that little doubting voice, like, what if Armand doesn't come back? What if this is my new normal? Louis awakes the next evening to sounds, and he realizes that it's someone removing the bricks and digging him out. Armand did come back and save him, which is probably no surprise considering he's telling this whole story to David right now. When Louis gets out, he realizes he's in like a room of bricked up coffins, and he wonders how many mad vampires are down in the bottom of the theater. As he's sort of like wondering this and trying to get his bearings, Armand is like pulling him, like telling him to hurry, guiding him out of the theater. And it isn't until they get outside that Louis realizes it's just him. He turns to look at Armand, and Armand, already guessing, says that he can't save Claudia and Madeleine. Louis won't have it, and he just like brushes Armand off and goes back into the theater. And Louis is ready like to brawl, but everyone there is just sort of like snide and catty to him, like, look who's returned, laughing about something that Louis doesn't quite understand yet. And Lestat is there, strangely quiet, not really making eye contact, and like fiddling with something that Louis can't quite make out. Where is she? Where is she? I looked about me at their still, passive faces, those inscrutable smiles. Lestat! I turned to him now, grabbing the black wool of his lapels. And then I saw the thing in his hands. I knew what it was. And in an instant, I ripped it from him and was staring at it, at the fragile, silken thing that was Claudia's yellow dress. His hand rose to his lips, his face turned away. And the soft, subdued sobs broke from him as he sat back while I stared at him. While I stared at the dress, my fingers moved over the tears in it, the stains of blood, my hands closing, trembling as I crushed it against my chest. Interview with a Vampire, page 300. These two lying under the gentle rain were Madeleine and Claudia. And Madeleine's lovely red hair mingled with the gold of Claudia's hair, which stirred and glistened in the wind and sucked through the open doorway. Only that which living had been burnt away. Not the hair, not the long, empty velvet dress, not the small, blood-stained chemise with its eyelets of white lace. And the blackened, burnt, and drawn-in thing that was Madeleine still bore the stamp of her living face. And the hand that clutched at the child was whole like a mummy's hand. But the child, the ancient one, my Claudia, was ashes. Page 301, Interview with a Vampire. Au revoir, Claudia. Louis falls apart. He goes complete deranged, and Armand grabs him and drags him back out of the vampiric theater. We get a lot of imagery in these next couple of pages, very jumbled and fragmented, and it's hard to piece together what's actually happening versus what Louis is hallucinating or imagining happening or just like expressing and emoting. But we know that Lestat called after them and they paid him no attention, and that Armand spent a long time whispering to Louis about how he couldn't prevent it. He couldn't prevent it. And it seems like Armand is trying to exert some kind of influence over Louis, perhaps to make him sleep, but it's not really taking. Louis is just way in the throes of it and can throw off any kind of vampire magic at this point in time. And Louis compares this loss to Claudia similarly to how he felt after the loss of his brother. There's the same recklessness, sense of despair, and where Louis had his clarity of thought against the priest after he confessed about his brother and the priest claimed the brother was the devil, he has the same cruel moment of clarity between him and Armand. I could not prevent it, Armand said softly to me, and I looked up to see his face unutterably sad. He looked away from me as if he felt it was futile to try to convince me of this, and I could feel his overwhelming sadness, his near defeat. I had the feeling that if I were to vent all my anger to him, he would do little to resist me. And I could feel that detachment, that passivity in him as something pervasive, which was at the root of what he insisted to me again. I could not have prevented it. But oh, you could have prevented it, I said softly. You know full well that you could have. You were the leader. You were the only one who knew the limits of your own power. They didn't know. They didn't understand. Your understanding surpassed theirs. He looked away still, but I could see the effect of my words on him. I could see the weariness on his face, the dull, lusterless sadness of his eyes. It was your own sense of self you would not violate, your own precious concept of truth. I understand you perfectly. I see you in the reflection of myself. That passivity in me has been the core of it all, the real evil, the weakness, the refusal to compromise a fractured and stupid morality, that awful pride. For that, I let myself become the thing I am when I knew it was wrong. For that, I let Claudia become the vampire she became when I knew it was wrong. For that, I stood by and let her kill Lestat when I knew that was wrong, the very thing that was her undoing. I lifted not a finger to prevent it. And Madeleine, I let her come to that, when I should never have made her a creature like ourselves. I knew that was wrong. Well, I tell you, I am no longer that passive, weak creature that is spun evil from evil till the web is vast and thick, while I remain its stultified victim. It's over. I know now what I must do, and I warn you for whatever mercy you've shown me in digging me out of that grave tonight where I would have died. Do not seek your shelter in the Théâtre des Vampires again. Do not go near it. Louis is going on his badass revenge arc. He spends that night in the cemetery. He just cleans out a grave and lays down in the slop. He rises the next night and knows exactly what he's gonna do. He befriends the carriageman, they go to the hotel and they get his sleeping arrangements. Louis pays him off to go to the Théâtre des Vampires, where Louis waits and waits till just before dawn. And then he goes in there with a bunch of kerosene and lights that place up. And while it's burning, he waits by the one and only Exit and starts scything people down when they come through. And wouldn't you know it, the one vampire he gets a good swing in is Santiago. He manages not only to gut him, but to shear his head clean off. And with that, Claudia and Madeleine are avenged. I couldn't take you away. I couldn't take you. But they will lie ruined and dead all around you. If the fire doesn't consume them, it will be the sun. I promise you, they will all die as you have died. Everyone who is closeted there this dawn will die. And they are the only deaths I have caused in my long life, which are both exquisite and good. Page 309 to 310. So the next evening, Lewis gets his Ocean's 11 after the heist moment. He goes to the Louvre. He stares longingly through the window, seeing the human guard, wishing, again that he was human and could do human things like chill at the Louvre. Armand meets him. They talk back and forth a little bit. Lewis asks Armand if they can go to the Louvre. Helps get the mortal people out of the way so they can walk at the paintings, and the two of them agree that they are going to hang out together and travel the world as two vampire companions. End part 3. That was a wild and intense ride. I feel like I should have quite a few closing thoughts, but real talk, I'm still living off the high of part 3. For now, I hope you're really enjoying these breakdowns of Interview with a Vampire. It's giving you all the details and the gossip you wanted. I'm having a really fun time scripting them, making the presentations, and doing the videos. If you're enjoying it too, can you go ahead and leave a like on the video and give me a bat emoji in those comments. Hey guys, welcome back from the high of Interview with the Vampire Part 3. Since I recorded that, I do have a couple additional presentation slides to share with y'all with some of my thoughts and feelings on the closing here. Louis killing the vampires who destroyed Claudia is the first and only time he takes action in this novel. In all other events, he observes. He protests, but he does nothing. Just like Armand. And this is the only time that Louis believes he's done something good, excluding when he decided to give Babette advice in part 1. So that leads me to asking, what does Interview with the Vampire have to say about action versus inaction? Is it safe to conclude that doing something is better than doing nothing, even when one can't save those they love? Are both Louis and Armand lost because they refuse to act? And would doing something bind them to time and life as much as choosing an outside being as an anchor can? Also, big things come in threes. This is the third and last fire in this book. First is the slave rebellion burning down Point de Loc. Then there's the fire at the old townhouse when Lestat comes to reclaim his fledglings. And now's the fire at the Théâtre des Vampires. Is there any significance to this? Also, what is going on with Armand? What is the extent of his complicity in Claudia's demise? Is he like Louis and an observer that lets the dominoes fall as they might? Is he the perpetrator? Claudia was Louis and Lestat's daughter. Armand would have become her adoptive father. Her loss will haunt Louis and Armand's relationship, no matter that Louis chooses to travel with him in the end. How can the two ever move past such a beginning? Should a relationship survive such a traumatic event? Will this bond the two together or drive them apart? And does culpability matter, or is just your presence at this kind of tragedy enough to sort of sour someone? Which kind of rolls me into the show tie-in here. One of the hard parts in adapting Anne Rice's work is how it crosses genres. A large part of the Interview with the Vampire is plotting and slow, very philosophy forward, heavy think pieces, not a lot of action. It's literally depression in a bottle. But then you get here to part 3 and you have one of the best action scenes in all of vampire times. I think pacing wise in a movie or a TV show, it's really hard to get the in-depth philosophy and thought pieces down while also leaving space for this kind of epic grandeur we get here at the end of part 3. But I think all of that explains some of the messiness of season 1, because all the stuff I felt least fit or I thought was the worst is when the narrative is adding these extra action moments into the show, just sort of force feeding me them, or when they're just randomly popping philosophy in but not really expounding upon it in any kind of meaningful way. Claudia's assault was entirely unnecessary, as was the violence of Louis and Lestat's big blow-up fight. But I think dropping these events into a story that's otherwise very boring, very like day-to-day kind of mundane, and like full of angsty ennui is necessary if you're going to lead into this big firefight moment in Act 3. And that's part of what makes Season 2 so good, is because it kind of combines Part 3 and Part 4 together and gives us the most explosive moments from both of those acts. So like just when things are getting a little bit boring in Paris and the vampires, we jump forward to the first interview and we get to see what happened there that led to a fallout, all of which is like more interesting than anything that actually happens in Part 4 of this series, so win there. And it gets us set up for the next part of the seasons. One thing that I do think is very interesting is both the show and the book discuss how vampires cannot create anything. In show, Louis is a photographer and he's trying to get his photos sold, and the art dealer tells him he just doesn't have it, which makes him really pissy at the time, but leads him to becoming an art dealer himself, because even though he can't make anything great, he can tell when someone else has made something great. And Armand too is super proud of his productions in show, is very artistic and takes like a lot of creative control over the shows and pride in them. But you know, before his Lulu production, people just sort of think he's like a weird little guy doing weird things, sort of like indicating again that vampires are just out of step with humanity. They can emulate stuff and like technically perform, but they're completely unable to make something with like that spark that makes it art instead of just mimicry. It's a very interesting concept like in this AI time frame, because we're seeing a lot of generative AI like creations right now, and we are having a conversation about whether or not you could consider it art because it doesn't have that essence of humanity in it. And like way back in the 70s, Anne Rice was like, nah, you need to have humanity in it for it to be authentic, which is especially interesting going into Season 3 of Interview with the Vampire or the book Queen of the Damned, because Lestat joins a rock band and becomes a rock band's like international sensation. And we have to ask if like he's actually holding the band back from real greatness, if it's just like his money, his ability to get the best creative human minds on it that kind of like make it so it seems like he's participating in the creation of art, or if this is like a counter narrative that sometimes vampires can make art. Welcome to Interview with a Vampire Part 4. We're here, guys. We made it. First and foremost, if you're just joining us now at Part 4, please go back to Interview with the Vampire Part 1 and start your journey there, because this series goes over each and every part of Interview with a Vampire. But second of all, if you are here and have been here the whole time, huge thank you to you guys. I know that watching 1 to 4 is a long commitment, and I really appreciate you being here and joining me for this ride. A quick synopsis of where we left off in Part 3. Claudia and Louis had traveled to Paris. They finally met real vampires. They got caught for killing Lestat, and Claudia ended up being killed. Louis went psycho mode on everyone and ended up killing all the vampires involved in Claudia's death. And then he and Armand had a little bit of a meeting, and they decided to go travel the world together as vampire partners. Which, of course, brings us right into Part 4. If any of you guys are like me, you might be wondering, this is still going on. I thought we hit an obvious and natural conclusion back in Part 3. And you'd be 100% correct. This Part 4 seems really tacked on to the end. It feels unlike anything we've read so far. And ultimately, I think for the most part, it's the most forgettable part of Interview with a Vampire. However, thematically, I do appreciate its existence because like a vampire keeps going and going and going way past natural expiration date, so does this story. We had a natural, perfect human conclusion. Losing Claudia, Louis getting revenge for Claudia, and riding off into the moonrise with Armand. But of course we can't leave it there on an upper note. We've got to see what Louis has been doing since then and why he's here by himself in this interview room with David. From a storytelling point, Interview has an interesting problem to tackle, because like with the more modern John Wick stories where John Wick's dog gets killed and he goes on a revenge killing spree to get back at everyone who harmed his animal, Louis Louis is in a tough spot. Just like we're 4 movies deep now into this John Wick saga, and he has never gone back to that normal life he treated everything to have. Louis is also in this situation where, like, how does he go back to a normal vampire existence? How does he find equilibrium after this end to Claudia? And the easiest answer is that Louis really doesn't go back to a normal life. He and Armand do travel the world. They experience fine art, beautiful natural wonder, the whole 9 yards. But Louis, even though he enjoys experiencing it, he never really seeks anything anymore. He's not looking for new knowledge or enlightenment. He's not looking for justification to exist. Done with humanity, he's done with change and goodness, and he wants nothing but to kill and to look at beautiful things in between those kills. And this sort of suggests that in the end, the vampires in the Theatre des Vampires really did win. They were right. Vampires don't change, they don't create, and they don't grow. Only humans have the skill for poetry, art, finer things, and change and development. Louis is incapable of being anything than what he always thought he was, which is an evil, cold, emotionless killer. He is literally embodying everything that both he and Claudia detested so much from those vampires. Louis might still love the world. He might still observe art and nature and the world and acknowledge its glory and inherent goodness. But there's a big difference between observing and seeking. Observing versus learning, and observing versus giving back. And Louis takes nothing and wants nothing anymore. Louis is significantly changed after Claudia's death, and we can see some influences from both of his previous vampire mentors. From Armand, he seems to take that stillness, that determination to exist and continue observing and noticing the beauty and wonder in the world. He also takes that frugal lifestyle and overall stillness and long pause of contemplation before doing anything. And from Lestat, he ends up taking that fierceness, that sharp tongue he sometimes had, the satisfaction with the kill, the idea that he can drink until he is full and be sated and happy. And he also takes that intense devotion that Lestat seemed to have to him. We don't see this necessarily between Louis and Armand, but Louis continues to be devoted to Claudia and his mourning of her and the idea of her long after she's left this world. Louis spends many years wondering if it would have been different, if he could have just seen Claudia and Madeleine leave and be free and existing in the world on their own. But in the end, he decides that everything is inevitable and futile. Even if Claudia was alive, Louis would eventually have become cold, lifeless, disinterested, and detached. It just all happened faster. And as always, we have to ask, do you agree with Louis? Would everything have ended the same no matter Claudia's survival? When you have eternity, must you eventually become detached from the world? And are you incapable of loving in the long term, or is love a feeling that you can continue to embody forever in an immortal existence? So about 100 years or so pass of Louis and Armand palling around the world. Louis kind of discounts Armand's presence. He's there, but they rarely talk or interact. And Armand continues like poking and prodding Louis and suggesting that they should go visit New Orleans, go back to his roots. And Louis keeps like sort of agreeing out of some kind of gentlemanly guilt, but never actually going because he realizes that he's not really providing for Armand or doing for Armand what he said he would. And then finally, one evening, Armand pushes the point a little bit by revealing to Louis that Lestat survived the attack at the Theatre des Vampires and went back to New Orleans to like live out his undead life. And we have to hold everything here because this is the third time that Armand has deceived Louis in this kind of way, and we don't get anything from the narrative describing like annoyance or wrongdoing or anything like that. So I just feel obligated to step in for a minute and ask why this is not a bigger deal. I mean, seriously, Louis goes on for pages and pages about how awful Lestat is, how he's a tyrant, how he's manipulative, how he won't ever let him leave. And Armand has been manipulating Louis from the beginning. First, like, forcing him to turn Madeleine so that he can leave Claudia to be with Armand. Then, like, not really being there when Claudia and Madeleine get burned, I guess because Louis wasn't deciding to leave them fast enough for Armand's liking, even though he's a 400-year-old vampire and could have waited forever. Or he could have just, like, joined the group and it could have been Claudia and Madeleine and Louis. Like, it was never adequately explained to me why they had to go separate ways. And now Here Armand is saying that he also knows that Lestat successfully escaped the Theatre de Vampire and never mentioned it in over 100 years of them traveling the globe because he was afraid it would like upset Louis when he was going through a difficult time. 100 years, my guy? Seriously. No, Armand is like manipulative and secretive and withholds information to try and get desired reactions and responses from Louis to get what he wants. And this is something that like adult Jess finds fascinating because when I first read Interview with a Vampire as a teen, I was significantly more anti-Lestat and pro-Armand. I wanted that Louis-Armand relationship to work out so badly as a teenager and never understood why it didn't. And I think part of it is because I was influenced by how Louis describes things. I wasn't like objectively looking at the interactions and how they were treating each other and who was doing more damage. I was more taking like Louis's word for it that Lestat was like an abusive beast and Armand was like the most gentle and patient of lovers. But it really seems like here, perhaps Lestat was the more authentic of the two of them and Armand is the more dangerous vampire to be around. To no one's surprise, mentioning Lestat is really all Armand ever needed to do to get Louis to go back to New Orleans. Louis is pleased with how much it hasn't changed, as much as pleased that so many things have changed in that city he once walked with Claudia and Lestat. He goes on a homecoming tour, viewing Point de Lac, the old townhouse the three of them used to live at. He's reliving those nostalgic memories and feeling something that, while not like Paris, seems very close to happiness, at least in his descriptions. And Louis is so confident that if Lestat survived, he'll be here in New Orleans and all he has to do is look. He eventually stumbles across a younger vampire and ends up following him around for a while because he figures if Lestat's here, he's connected to all the vampires in the area. And this eventually pays off because that younger vampire one night has a rushed kill in a house where he drinks from a woman and brings out a young infant child that he carries back to this decrepit old mansion where in the middle of this blazing summer heat, there's a huge fire and there's a cranky vampire in a robe and slippers like shuffling around complaining that they're too cold. And even in an old bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, Louis recognizes the hair, that voice. This huddled creature is Lestat. As Louis observes the interactions between the younger vampire and this older vampire, he learns that Lestat no longer leaves the house. He's killing mostly animals, and he's like leaving the animal carcasses piled up in a corner over here, which is highly unusual for vampires. They usually can't stand to be anywhere near the dead bodies of their kills, and killing animals in general is incredibly unusual for Lestat. He used to mock Louis mercilessly for it. Before Louis even knows what he's doing though, he just has to know more. He like taps up against the window, the two vampires turn and see him, and Lestat is like ecstatic and like begging him to come in and join them, and Louis is like heading in before he can think better of it. And as Louis and Lestat reunite, Lestat is so moved and overwhelmed, he's having trouble speaking, and Louis goes to him and sort of like help guides him to a chair, tells him it's okay, he doesn't have to speak, to take his time. He's also like insisting that he won't hurt Lestat the same way he's sort of been insisting to David this whole time he's not going to hurt him. He's got like a very protective, gentlemanly air going on. The infant baby that's in the room has been crying. Louis is like picks that kid up and starts trying to comfort it and getting it to simmer down. He just wants everything to be like calm and have like this nice visit with Lestat. And briefly, Louis also has this aside where he's never killed something as young as this child, and he seems to be more interested and invested in describing the infant and its reactions and emotions than he is actually interacting with Lestat, which is a sort of strange thing for him to do after so long a reunion. Lestat apologizes for Claudia's death. He said he never wanted Santiago to kill her, never intended for that outcome. He says he never wanted Claudia to die. He just wanted her to learn a lesson, and he wanted Louis with him just so badly. But in the same breath claiming that he wanted Claudia to continue to exist, he also claims he never should have made Claudia to begin with. She was too young and she was not right as a vampire. And Louis doesn't react in anger or upset or any other emotion we've learned to expect from him. Instead, Louis goes still and he seems to be thinking about how it seems Claudia never even existed at all. The secret and secluded nature of vampire life allows the loss of one of their own to feel very similar to a family's loss of a child or a miscarriage. How does one appropriately mourn such a young life? How does one reconcile with a loss that's such great personal import and impacts the world so so little. Lestat inevitably asks Louis to come home and stay with him forever, and Louis refuses. And Louis observes that Lestat is at the end of his Era's tour. A siren goes by while the two of them are talking, and Lestat jumps and buries himself in Louis's chest in sheer abject terror of the sound and the red flashing light. And Lestat asks Louis how he can stand it, and Louis is beginning to understand that this is that slow, vampiric death that Armand was speaking about back at Paris, where vampires can't survive past their era. He thinks about how Lestat was and their time in New Orleans together. He was lively and singing. He loved theater and the arts and killing and interacting with people on the streets and singing and repeating lines from all kinds of plays. And all of that engagement and interest and pride in his looks doesn't at all resemble the cuddling creature that Lestat has become now. And he wonders if that investment in humanity is all paid back on the inability to understand or adjust as time moves on without you. Louis implies that that detachment that he's gained and that Armand has always had is a necessary survival and coping mechanism for vampires as they continue to age and progress through humanity. If they're too involved in mortal life, if they care too deeply or become too invested in any one era, they're not able to deal with it when times change and things move on. And it leaves them in this state that Lestat is in now, where they're wasting away as the world keeps going. Louis ponders all the things he might say to Lestat, all the warnings he might give, all the words he might speak to help him adjust to this new modern era. And in the end, he's just silent. Lestat keeps begging him to stay, saying he has something he wants to say to Louis. Louis asks him what it is. Lestat remains silent. And Louis just kind of nods, holds on to the infant child as he gets up and leaves Lestat to die. On the outside, Louis might seem very cold and removed from Lestat, but during their conversation, quite a few emotions, imagery, memories sort of arose in his head, and it included this deep and intense sadness that might have even been linked back to his human life when either his father or brother passed. He doesn't allow it to fully surface or to fully flesh out the imagery, so even we as readers aren't 100% sure what that moment was. But he retreats from that grief and shields himself with all the vampiric detachment he's gained. Even Lestat is going to this place of grief and loss. And then something in his own mind must protect him as well because his eyes get misty and he becomes less coherent. And I wanted to point out this flip between the selfish and the selfless here between Lestat and Louis, because there's something very selfish in Louis's inability to reach out and help Lestat now as he's dying. And it's something that he's doing specifically to protect himself and to maintain his own stoic nature and his own survival. And there's also something very selfless in the way that Lestat is approaching Louis, apologizing for all of his misdeeds, talking about Claudia, talking about their life together, fawning on him and otherwise admiring him for different aspects. And granted, in this there's a kernel of self-motivation because Lestat does want Louis to stay with him. He does recognize a need for him. But there's also something selfless in knowing that you're near the end and wanting to make right or to help alleviate the suffering of those who you leave to linger on. Louis does eventually reveal to Armand that he met up with Lestat, but it's not right away. It's a month or more later. And Armand is deeply upset by this. He asks Louis, but what did you feel? Louis is very confused by this question. He's kind of thrown by Armand's whole stance. Why does Armand care what Louis feels? Why is he so involved? Why is this so unusual from other long periods the two have gone without speaking to each other? But Armand becomes increasingly distressed, and when he comes to believe that Louis truly felt nothing seeing Lestat and that nothing Lestat said could move him in any way, shape, or form, that's when Armand reveals that he is the one who actually pushed Claudia out into the sun to her death. It's pretty obvious he's trying to get some kind of reaction from Louis, whether it's anger or for the two of them to have a fight or end this resentment and silence between the two of them. I don't know what the goal was in revealing this. I don't even know if it's really true or not. I suppose Louis doesn't know either. He just shrugs it off so nonchalantly. He doesn't even care in investigating this, so we never really get a good answer. And I don't know that it would matter if we did get an answer, or if this investment that I'm feeling in exactly who killed Claudia matters at all. But I guess Louis is just over entirely because he has no reaction at all to Armand. Not even like those deep internal feelings he had when he was speaking to Lestat. Something in the way his smooth white face reflected it, only for an instant, reminded me of someone else I'd seen defeated in just that way. And it was amazing to me that it took me such a long moment to see Claudia's face in that attitude. Claudia, as she stood by the bed in the room at the Hotel Saint Gabriel, pleading with me to transform Madeleine into one of us. That same helpless look, that defeat which seemed to be so heartfelt that everything beyond it was forgotten. And then he, like Claudia, seemed to rally, to pull on some reserve of strength. But he said softly to the air, "I am dying." Page 333, Interview with a Vampire. And here we get Armand coming clean. He admits that he felt Louis would eventually get over Claudia's loss, and that Louis would love him again, and that the two of them would travel the world seeking knowledge and information and mentoring each other in all different kinds of ways. He thought Louis's curiosity would return to him, that it was the one thing within him that would never die. But he is no longer curious. He no longer seeks, and Armand doesn't know what to do with him. And honestly, Louis channels Lestat in this incredibly brutal moment between him and Armand. "I wanted love and goodness in this which is living death," I said. "It was impossible from the beginning, because you cannot have love and goodness when you do what you know to be evil, what you know to be wrong. You can only have the desperate confusion and the longing and the chasing of the phantom goodness in all its human form. I knew the real answer to my question before I ever reached Paris. I knew it when I first took a human life to feed my craving. It was my death, and yet I would not accept it, could not accept it, because like all creatures, I don't wish to die. And so I sought other vampires, for God, for the devil, for 100 things under 100 names, and it was all the same, all evil." Page 334, Interview with a Vampire. Once Armand gets this response, he knows there's nothing else to do. Whatever there was or could have been between him and Louis is gone forever. He makes one last attempt. "Is there anything else you want of me? Anything else you require?" Louis is kind of confused, but he's like, "No, bro, I'm fine. I kind of want you to leave so I can stare at this river alone." And Armand walks away from Louis and is never seen again. Louis waits a little while. It takes some time to realize that Armand is gone for good. But when he does, he takes Armand's casket and puts it in the tomb he has for his family. Except eventually Louis becomes uncomfortable with Armand's casket laying there, and he goes to the tomb and rips that casket to tiny little pieces. Louis is back to being slightly emo and at loose ends when he runs into the younger vampire Lestat, and that young vampire begs to be his companion, begs Louis to teach him the ways of the vampire, begs for them to travel the world and be immortal together forever. Louis is not having that. He's been there, done that, does not care to try it again, and tells that young vampire if he ever sees him again, he will destroy him. Once that is done, Louis knows that it's all way too much for him. He doesn't want to be around anything familiar or that will remind him of anyone or anything, so he retreats to the woods to be a hermit and to be completely surrounded by all that is unfamiliar. And that, dear reader, is the end to Louis's story. And if you thought that was a lame ending, don't worry, David did too, because he explodes for the first time, loses all sense of professionalism when interviewing anyone. "It didn't have to end like that," said the boy, leaning forward. "All the things you felt in Paris, the love of Claudia, the feeling, even the feeling for Lestat, it didn't have to end. Not in this despair, because that's what it is, isn't it? Despair." Louis is kind of annoyed by David's outburst, but he sort of shrugs. He's like, "Yeah, this is inevitable. This is the way things are. Deal with it, human guy." And David pushes, saying that it wouldn't have ended that way for him. Just go on and turn him into a vampire and he will show him all the things that he doesn't get. He spent too long not being human. Louis doesn't need to be a Debbie Downer all the time. This makes Louis incredibly angry. He's like, "You've missed the whole point of this conversation, my guy. And the fact that the only takeaway you have is that you want to be a vampire too, breaks me. And there's only one appropriate response." And that's Louis, grabbing David up and drinking his blood. David scrambles a little bit because he knows the vampire is angry and he doesn't think he's going to be turned. And he's like, am I going to die? Am I going to die? And Lewis is like, I don't know. And then he pieces out. Later that afternoon, David awakes. He's woozy. He's got a bite mark up here in his neck he can feel, and he has this tape recorder and he's rewinding it and listening to different portions of the recorder when he gets to Lestat, off St. Charles Avenue. Old house, crumbling. Shabby neighborhood. Look for rusted railings. David leaves the interview site, presumably going in search of Lestat to get him to turn him into a vampire. And that is the end of Interview with a Vampire. This original story does leave us with some questions, like whether or not David actually finds Lestat, whether or not he actually goes through with searching for him. These are all unanswered, lingering questions that we may or may not get more information for in future vampire installments. I think what ended up sticking with me longest in this story is Claudia and her presence. I'd argue that in a lot of ways the story isn't Lewis's but Claudia's, and that makes quite a bit of sense given that Anne Rice wrote this while she was dealing with the grief of the loss of her own child. It also makes sense that Lewis would be a character that could never come out of his own grief. But overall, Interview with a Vampire is a beautiful story filled with stylized, poetic writing. Fits right in with Lewis's character. As sad and depressed as reading this book makes me, and it does make me quite sad, it's also a beautiful and wonderful story that I would encourage people to read when they feel they're in the space to do. I've had a ton of fun putting these videos together, making this PowerPoint, doing the whole song and dance. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching, and I want to thank you again so much for sticking with me all the way to the end here in part 4. And let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to see more videos in this style, either Lestat the Vampire or some other kind of story in the future. It's crazy to look back and see how rushed and pressed for time I was in the back 2 parts of these video creations, but since then I do have a couple of wrap-up thoughts I wanted to share with you. Starting with Daniel's choices. Would you react similarly to Daniel? Would you go so far as to actually look for Lestat? Is there more than immortality to it for Daniel? Do you think he's trying to escape mortal prejudice or judgment because it seems like he might be homosexual or bisexual? And what do you think a happy ending for Daniel would look like? And then what do we think? What is the nature of the vampire in Anne Rice's works? What connection, if any, can you make to other vampire stories? What do you think of the depiction of vampires? How does the vampire work for a metaphor for grief or loss? What did you think of each of these vampires' individual relationships? What did you think of these vampires' coping mechanisms when it comes to transforming from a mortal to immortal being? The journey of Louis' sexuality as told by his vampiric kills. Originally, Louis decides to eat only animals, which we could interpret as asexuality, or we could interpret choosing animals as abstaining, which is like a nod to his Catholic upbringing and the shame he might have around sex and sexuality just generally. And Lestat forces Louis to perform as a vampire should, sort of paralleling the journey that many closeted people might have experienced when forced to sort of pass as straight. Louis' choices to later kill indiscriminately sort of suggest a bi or pansexuality, like the actual person he consumes doesn't matter to him. This could actually be a result of his trauma of him being forced to take on human kills again. And Louis does continually describe his murders as something he must do, but he doesn't actually take any pleasure in, which is very different than how all other vampires describe exchanging blood, whether it's them taking human victims or them swapping blood with other vampires. But it does seem to strongly reinforce the narrative that Louis might be asexual, or he might be a heavily closeted gay man and therefore incapable of owning his own sexuality and finding partnership and joy. And then a couple final book club questions for the road. Which character did you relate to most? Obviously I'm a Claudia stan through and through. Were there any character takes or actions that you thought were objectively right or superior to other people's interpretation of events? What dangling plot threads would you hope to see more of in the Vampire Chronicles? And do you have a favorite scene or part of the book? all of which kind of rolls me into talking a little bit about the show. Part 4 is told at the same time as Part 3 within Season 2 of Interview with the Vampire, the TV show, which I think is really clever because the way this book ends is really depressing and meandering and anticlimactic, which is intentional for the book. And like great literature because it gives you that feeling of depression and meaninglessness that it like intends to, which is kind of gut-wrenching in its own way. But it is not like a great way to leave a TV show off if you want people to come in for part 2. So I think like interweaving the two stories of like what happened in Paris along with what happened in the first interview and like the fallout of what happened in Paris present day makes sense because it gives this cathartic, wrapping it all up, like real-time feel to it. Plus this Louis is so much more emotional, so much more active, take charge than our book Louis. I think all of this, like him having agency and stuff, really leans into making it a better TV show, although not necessarily like super authentic to the ending of this first book. I do think it sets us up really well for a lot of what you'll feel in The Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned and some of the other books in the Chronicles. And of course this has finally got us to the reset of where we need to be at the end of Interview with the Vampire because Louis, Armand, and Lestat are all alive and in like 3 separate locations. We do go ahead and turn Daniel a little bit early in the Vampire Chronicles timeline, but that makes sense because we've aged Daniel up and he's only got so long to live, so we have to kind of sort of turn him now. And he still gets turned by Armand, although I'll be very curious to see what Armand's reasoning was in the show because it seems very nonsensical here and now. I do kind of wonder if it's a manipulative play on Armand's part, like Louis has mentioned a couple of times that he would turn Daniel. So Armand is like doing it for him so they can have the same kind of mental connection. And like it's Armand's way of being like, I still don't see what's so special about you, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn you because it's something Louis sees. It will be interesting to see where the justification for that is and what side Armand is on now that him and Louis are broken up. Armand in show seems like a character that can't stand to be alone, and a little bit that plays into like the Chronicle of the Vampire book lore too. Like I can see a version of him that's like that. But if that's the case, I sort of feel like he's gonna go join the other vampires now that Louis like cast him out. But here I am 2 years later, finally working on and probably about to release the Vampire Lestat version of all this. I feel like I've come so far in my ability to augment voice and do background stuff and make better slides. Like I think visually all that's going to be so much better. And I have finally watched seasons 1 and 2 of Interview with the Vampire. Cannot wait for season 3. I just am really loving like this revival of Gothic work and this celebration of one of Anne Rice's like larger book legacies. But talk to me in those comments down below. Have you read Interview with the Vampire? Have you seen the show? What are you thinking on it? And as always, keep reading.